Welcome, wanderers. As the moon hangs heavy and the world outside falls silent, let the shadows in your room deepen and your guard fall. For the next 3 hours, we're diving into tales of the chilling and the unknown. Stories specifically crafted to lull you into an uneasy rest. So dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and prepare to drift into a slumber haunted by whispers from the dark. Comment down below where you're listening from and drop a like in the name of fear. The old hunting lodge, nestled deep within the Blackwood Peaks, wasn't just remote. It felt like a scar on the face of the earth. Its weathered timber walls sagged, its windows were perpetually misted, and a perpetual chill clung to its very stones, even in the height of summer. For Liam, Chloe, Sam, and Maya, it was meant to be an escape, a desperate attempt to outrun the silent, suffocating weight that had settled over their lives. They had been inseparable since college, a quartet bound by shared dreams and late-night talks. But somewhere along the winding road of adulthood, the light had faded. Liam, the quiet artist, hadn't touched a brush in months, his studio gathering dust like a forgotten tune. Chloe, the outwardly cheerful one, maintained her bright facade with a terrifying fragility, her eyes betraying a deep, unyielding weariness. Sam, the cynical joker, found his wit turning bitter, his laughter hollow. And Maya, the meticulous academic, was drowning in a sea of research papers she could no longer comprehend, her sharp mind dulled by an endless fog. Their collective depression, a silent, insidious fifth member of their group, had become an unspoken pact of misery. The idea for the retreat had been Chloe's, a last-ditch effort to reconnect with nature and ourselves. Liam had nodded vaguely, Sam had snorted a sarcastic remark about therapy in the wilderness, and Maya had merely stared at her laptop screen, unseeing. Yet they had come. Anything was better than the suffocating familiarity of their own apartments, each a monument to their individual despair. The lodge, however, offered no solace. The moment they stepped inside, the chill intensified, a damp, clinging cold that seeped into their bones, no matter how many layers they wore. It wasn't just the temperature. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from their lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. Their first night was filled with forced cheer. Chloe unpacked board games. Sam poured cheap whiskey. Liam stared into the crackling, reluctant fire, and Maya tried to read, her eyes scanning lines without registering meaning. But the lodge seemed to listen. Every creak of the old timbers, every groan of settling foundations, felt amplified, deliberate. The silence between their strained conversations was heavy, expectant. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls of Liam's room, directly behind his bed. Not frantic, like a mouse, but slow, deliberate, almost purposeful, like nails dragging on plaster. He tried to rationalize it, a loose floorboard in the room above, a branch against the exterior. But the tapping persisted, a maddening rhythm that often continued for hours, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. He'd press his ear against the cold plaster, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the sound would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence of his room. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts. Chloe, meanwhile, found herself plagued by phantom laughter. Not the joyful sound she so desperately tried to project, but a thin, reedy giggle that seemed to emanate from the empty corners of the kitchen, especially when she was alone, trying to force herself to cook. It was undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy, a sound of ancient, malicious amusement. She'd spin around, clutching a saucepan, only to find nothing but the oppressive silence and the pervasive cold. It made her forced smiles crack, revealing the raw despair beneath. Sam, ever the cynic, started hearing his own voice, distorted and mocking, whispering his deepest insecurities back to him from the shadows of the common room. Worthless. Failure. Everyone sees it. He'd snap back, "Shut up," only to be met with silence, and the chilling realization that no one else had heard it. His sarcasm became a frantic defense, aimed at invisible tormentors. Maya, in her attempt to find solace in logic, began to notice her meticulously organized research notes scattering themselves across the floor, or pages turning on their own in her open books. One night, she watched, horrified, as a pen rolled across the table and began to draw a series of intricate, swirling symbols on a blank page, symbols she didn't recognize, yet felt ancient and deeply unsettling. The air around her grew thick with the scent of ozone, like after a lightning strike. They tried to talk about it, huddled around the sputtering fireplace, their faces pale in the flickering light. "Are you guys hearing things?" Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chloe nodded, her eyes wide and tearful. "The laughter, it's everywhere." Sam just stared into his whiskey glass. "My own damn voice, telling me I'm a joke." Maya, however, tried to rationalize. "It's the isolation, the stress, the old house settling. Our minds are playing tricks on us." But even as she spoke, her gaze darted nervously towards the shadows, her voice lacking its usual conviction. Their shared depression, instead of binding them against the encroaching horror, seemed to be amplifying it, making them more vulnerable, more isolated within their own minds. That night, the activity escalated. The tapping became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of Liam's bedroom wall. He pressed his ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the lodge's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing he had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses Chloe kept smelling, now sickly sweet and putrid. Chloe, unable to bear the laughter any longer, found herself drawn to the attic access panel in the ceiling of the hallway. The tapping was deafening here, a furious drumming. She could hear the distinct sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floorboards above, accompanied by a low, guttural groan. The giggling intensified, surrounding her, pressing in. She scrambled back, tripping over her own feet, collapsing in a heap on the floor. Sam, driven to the brink by the mocking whispers, started shouting at the empty air, his face contorted with rage and fear. He threw a whiskey bottle at the wall, shattering it, the crash echoing through the silent house. "Show yourselves, you cowards!" he screamed, his voice cracking. The whispers only grew louder, more numerous, a chorus of derision. Maya, desperate to find a logical explanation, stumbled into the lodge's small, dusty library. The books on the shelves seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. She pulled out an old, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. As she opened it, the symbols she'd seen drawn by the pen on her notes were scrawled across the first page, accompanied by archaic script. The air grew thick with ozone and the scent of decay. She began to read, her eyes widening in horror as she deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the lodge, echoing from the attic. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through their already frayed nerves. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before. Then, from the attic access panel, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, dripping onto the hallway floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the attic opening, something began to descend. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space of the hallway. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty floor with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the provider Maya had just read about, the entity that fed on their despair. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from them. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire hallway, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on the four friends with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with their ears but impressed directly into their minds, echoed in their skulls, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Liam stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. Chloe let out a whimpering sob, her forced cheer utterly shattered. Sam stared, his cynicism replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. Maya dropped the journal, its brittle pages scattering, her academic mind reeling from the impossible, horrifying truth. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled them with a horror that transcended even their deepest depression. This wasn't just a fix. It was a pact. They were its sustenance. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards them. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in their guts screamed for it, but their minds recoiled. Run! Liam screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. They turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. They scrambled through the living room, past the shrouded furniture, their feet slipping on the dusty floorboards. The lodge seemed to come alive around them, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The walls groaned, the floorboards buckled, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow them whole. They reached the front door, their hands fumbling with the ancient lock, their fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the floorboards growing louder, a relentless pursuit. They could feel its presence behind them, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, Sam wrenched the door open, snapping the old lock, and they burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit them like a shock, washing over their sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the lodge. They didn't look back. They just ran, blindly, through the overgrown yard, past the skeletal trees, towards the faint, distant lights of Blackwood Peaks. They could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind them, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs gave out, until they collapsed on the side of the winding mountain road, gasping for air, tears streaming down their faces. The despair still clung to them, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. They had seen the face of their own darkness, and it had been hungry. They eventually found their way back to civilization, a small, lost group, their eyes haunted, their bodies emaciated. They tried to explain, to warn, but their words came out as choked sobs, incoherent babbling. No one believed them. They were just four depressed friends who had gone on a disastrous retreat. They never returned to the Blackwood Peaks. They abandoned all their belongings, their cars, their past lives within those walls. The cheap lodge had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. Months later, scattered across different cities, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The shared trauma, the sheer, undeniable horror they had faced together, had forged a new, fragile connection between them. They talked now, truly talked, about the lodge, about their despair, about the unspeakable thing that had fed on their sorrow. The shared secret was a bond, a dark anchor that paradoxically pulled them closer, a testament to their survival. Their depression wasn't cured, not entirely. The scars ran deep, etched into their very beings. But they faced it together now, no longer isolated islands of sorrow. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, Liam would still feel a lingering chill. Chloe would hear a faint, reedy chuckle. Sam would swear he heard his own mocking voice, and Maya would see faint, swirling symbols in the patterns of condensation on a window. And they knew, with a chilling certainty, that the old hunting lodge wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten secrets. And they were just 4 more offerings in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night they escaped its insidious embrace. They were survivors, but they were also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed them whole. They had escaped, yes, but they carried a piece of the lodge, and its despair, within them, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed them. The whispering walls of Blackwood Manor. The old Ford Bronco coughed its last breath at the edge of the overgrown driveway, a final metallic wheeze that seemed to echo the weariness in Liam's own bones. Dust, thick and red from miles of unpaved road, coated every surface, blurring the lines between the truck, the dying light of the setting sun, and the skeletal trees that clawed at the bruised sky. Before him, shrouded in a perpetual twilight even in the fading afternoon, stood Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just old. It was ancient, a hulking silhouette against the horizon, its gables like jagged teeth, its windows like vacant, staring eyes. Local legend whispered of its former inhabitants, the Blackwood family, who had vanished without a trace over a century ago, leaving behind a legacy of chilling tales and an estate that no one dared to claim. Liam, a freelance photographer specializing in urban decay and the macabre, saw not a haunted house, but a canvas, a challenge, a story waiting to be told through his lens. He grabbed his heavy camera bag, the familiar weight a small comfort against the prickle of unease that had begun to crawl up his spine the moment he turned off the main road. The air grew colder as he approached, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old blood. The iron gates, rusted to a brittle lace, groaned a protest as he pushed them open, the sound a mournful sigh in the stillness. The driveway, once meticulously paved, was now a fractured mosaic of cracked flagstones and tenacious weeds. A lone, gnarled oak, its branches twisted into grotesque shapes, stood sentinel near the crumbling porch, its leaves rustling with an almost human whisper. Liam paused, his hand instinctively going to the small, silver crucifix he always wore beneath his shirt. He wasn't particularly religious, but some places just demanded a little extra protection. The front door, a massive slab of dark, splintered wood, hung ajar, revealing a maw of impenetrable darkness. He pushed it open further, the hinges screaming in agony, a sound that reverberated through the silent house. The air inside was thick and cold, heavy with the scent of dust, mildew, and something else, something that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. A faint, cloying sweetness, like forgotten potpourri mixed with the metallic tang he'd noticed outside. He switched on his powerful headlamp, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating a grand foyer swallowed by shadows. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped from the chandelier, which hung precariously, its crystal pendants dulled by a century of neglect. The grand staircase, once a testament to opulence, now sagged precariously, its banister splintered, its steps groaning under the weight of time. "Hello?" Liam's voice, a mere whisper in the vast emptiness, was swallowed instantly, leaving only the sound of his own ragged breathing. He felt foolish, but the silence was oppressive, demanding some kind of vocal intrusion. He began his work, camera clicking, the flash momentarily illuminating forgotten details. A tarnished silver tray on a dust-laden side table, a faded portrait whose eyes seemed to follow him, a moth-eaten tapestry depicting a hunting scene, the figures frozen in an eternal chase. Each click of the shutter felt like a heartbeat, a small defiance against the overwhelming stillness. As he moved deeper into the house, the atmosphere grew heavier. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, not just with his weight, but with an unsettling rhythm, as if something else was moving, just out of sight. He entered what must have been the drawing room, its once vibrant wallpaper peeling in grotesque strips, revealing the dark, damp plaster beneath. A grand piano, its keys yellowed and silent, stood in one corner, a sheet of music still open on its stand, the notes faded beyond recognition. He raised his camera, framing a shot of the piano, when a faint, discordant note seemed to drift from its keys. Liam froze, his finger hovering over the shutter button. He waited, straining his ears, but the sound didn't repeat. Just the oppressive silence, punctuated by the frantic drumming of his own heart. He shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination, a trick of the old house and his own frayed nerves. He continued his exploration, his headlamp sweeping through the gloom, revealing a dining room with a massive empty table, its chairs overturned as if a sudden, violent departure had occurred. Then the kitchen, a cavern of rusted appliances and shattered crockery. Each room told a story of abandonment, of lives abruptly interrupted. It was in the master bedroom that the true chill set in. The four-poster bed, its canopy torn and shredded, dominated the room. On the bedside table, a porcelain doll sat propped up, its painted eyes staring blankly into the darkness. Its dress, once pristine, was now grimy and torn. Liam felt a cold dread seep into his bones. Dolls, especially old ones, always unnerved him. This one, however, felt different, felt watched. As he aimed his camera at the doll, a faint scratching sound emanated from inside the wardrobe. It was soft, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. Liam's breath hitched. He wasn't alone. He wasn't just imagining things anymore. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely a croak. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was even more profound, more menacing. He took a hesitant step towards the wardrobe, his hand trembling as he reached for the ornate, tarnished handle. He pulled it open with a sudden jerk, revealing not a person, but a cavernous, empty space. The scratching had stopped, but the faint, sweet, metallic smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. He shone his light into the depths of the wardrobe, seeing nothing but dust motes dancing in the beam. He slowly closed the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He backed away from the wardrobe, his eyes fixed on the doll. Had it moved, or was it just his mind playing tricks? He couldn't be sure. He decided it was time to move on, to explore the upper floors, to get away from the unsettling presence of that doll. The staircase groaned under his weight as he ascended, each step a testament to the house's decay. The upper landing was a maze of shadowy doorways. He chose the first one, pushing open a door that led into what appeared to be a child's nursery. The air here was even colder, carrying a faint, sweet scent, like baby powder mixed with something else, something sickly. A rocking horse stood in the center of the room, its painted eyes chipped, its mane tangled. A crib, its wooden bars splintered, stood against one wall, and on the floor, scattered amongst the dust and debris, were a collection of antique toys. A tin soldier, a wooden train, a small porcelain tea set. Liam's headlamp swept across the room, and then he saw it. On the far wall, Faintly visible beneath layers of grime and peeling wallpaper was a series of childlike drawings. Stick figures, houses, suns, and then, in one corner, a crudely drawn figure with long, spindly limbs and empty, staring eyes. It was unsettling, the kind of drawing that would give you nightmares. He felt a sudden, intense drop in temperature, a cold that seemed to penetrate his very bones. He shivered violently, his breath misting in the frigid air. Then, from the corner of the room, he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible giggle. A child's giggle. Liam spun around, his headlamp darting frantically, but there was nothing. Just the rocking horse, perfectly still, and the empty crib. His blood ran cold. He was definitely not alone. He stumbled back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to get out. He had to leave this place. He turned to flee, but as he did, his foot caught on something. He looked down and saw a small wooden block, painted with a single, faded letter, L. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his ankle as he twisted it, sending him sprawling to the floor. His headlamp clattered away, plunging the room into near darkness. Only a sliver of moonlight, filtering through a grimy window, offered any illumination, casting long, distorted shadows. He scrambled to retrieve his headlamp, his fingers fumbling in the gloom. As he reached for it, a small, cold hand brushed against his. He recoiled, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He shone the light, his hand shaking, but there was nothing there, only the wooden block still lying on the floor. He snatched up the headlamp, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his ankle. He had to get out, now. He limped out of the nursery, his eyes darting wildly, convinced he saw movement in the periphery of his vision, heard faint whispers carried on the cold air. He stumbled down the grand staircase, each creak of the wood a fresh jolt of terror. He reached the foyer, the front door still ajar, a beacon of hope. He lunged for it, his hand outstretched, when a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed it shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the house. Liam cried out, stumbling back. He tried the handle, but it was stuck, jammed tight. Panic, cold and raw, seized him. He was trapped. He turned, his headlamp sweeping the foyer, and then he saw them. Shadows. Not just ordinary shadows, but shapes that seemed to writhe and coalesce in the corners of the room, growing larger, darker, more defined. They were indistinct at first, like smoke, but then they began to take on forms, tall and slender, with elongated limbs and heads that seemed to tilt at unnatural angles. A low, guttural growl seemed to emanate from the very walls, a sound that vibrated through his chest. The air grew impossibly colder, and the sweet, metallic scent intensified, making him gag. He backed away, pressing himself against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. The shadows advanced, slowly, deliberately, their forms becoming clearer. He could almost make out features now, empty eye sockets, mouths stretched in silent screams. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block them out, trying to convince himself it wasn't real. But the cold was too intense, the growling too real, the scent too pervasive. He opened his eyes, and they were closer now, almost upon him. He screamed, a raw, primal sound ripped from his throat, and lunged for the nearest window, smashing his camera against the glass. It shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying inwards. He didn't care about the cuts, the pain. He just needed to escape. He scrambled through the broken window, tearing his clothes, his skin, but he didn't feel it. He landed hard on the overgrown lawn, his injured ankle screaming in protest. He pushed himself up, ignoring the pain, and began to run. He ran blindly, stumbling through the darkness. The sounds of the house, the growling, the whispers, the faint, childish giggles echoing in his ears. He didn't stop until he reached the rusted gates, tearing his hands on the sharp iron as he forced them open. He didn't stop until he reached his Bronco, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert them into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, a miraculous sound. He slammed the gear into reverse, spinning the truck around, and sped away, leaving Blackwood Manor behind, a dark, malevolent presence against the moonlit sky. He drove for hours, not knowing where he was going, just needing to put as much distance as possible between himself and that house. When the first rays of dawn finally pierced the darkness, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, he pulled over on the side of a deserted road, his body trembling uncontrollably. He looked down at his hands, still shaking, and then at his camera bag, which lay on the passenger seat. He hesitated, then reached for it, pulling out his camera. He scrolled through the images he had taken, his heart sinking with each click. The foyer, the drawing room, the dining room, the kitchen, all were there, captured in stark, chilling detail. But then he got to the master bedroom, the image of the porcelain doll, and next to it, barely visible in the shadows, was a faint, translucent figure, a child. Its eyes were dark, empty, staring directly into the lens. He gasped, dropping the camera. He scrolled further to the nursery, the rocking horse, the crib. And then, in the corner where he had seen the crude drawing, was the same translucent figure, standing beside the rocking horse, its head tilted, a faint, chilling smile on its lips. He threw the camera onto the seat, his stomach churning. It wasn't his imagination. It was real. They were real. He looked up, his eyes scanning the horizon, the rising sun, the familiar world. But the world no longer felt familiar, felt tainted. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would never truly escape Blackwood Manor. Its whispers, its shadows, its cold, dead eyes would haunt him forever. And the faint, sweet, metallic scent, he knew now what it was. It was the scent of death, the scent of a presence that had never left. And it was clinging to him, a silent, invisible shroud. He was marked, and Blackwood Manor would always be waiting. The silence of apartment 4B. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and reflective, mirroring the neon glow of distant signs. Detective Miles Corbin, a man whose face was etched with too many late nights and too much coffee, adjusted the collar of his trench coat. Beside him, his assistant, the perpetually optimistic and sharp-witted Amelia Vance, shivered slightly, pulling her own jacket tighter. "Another missing person, Miles?" Amelia asked, her breath misting in the cool night air. "This is the third one this month from this building." Miles grunted, his gaze fixed on the imposing, Art Deco apartment complex before them. The building, known as the Obsidian, was a relic of a bygone era, its dark stone facade and gargoyle-adorned ledges casting long, ominous shadows. "Yeah, this time it's a Mr. Arthur Finch from apartment 4B, reported missing by his sister. Said he hadn't answered his phone in 3 days, which was unlike him." They entered the lobby, a grand but unsettling space with a mosaic floor depicting a swirling, abstract pattern that seemed to shift under their feet. The air was heavy, stagnant, carrying a faint, cloying scent that Miles couldn't quite place. It wasn't decay, not exactly. More like old, stale air mixed with something else, something subtly metallic. The elevator creaked its way to the 4th floor, its brass doors groaning open to reveal a dimly lit hallway. The silence here was profound, broken only by the distant hum of the city and the soft scuff of their shoes on the worn carpet. Apartment 4B was at the very end of the hall, its heavy, dark wood door standing out against the lighter walls. Miles knocked, a series of sharp raps that echoed unervingly in the stillness. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. Standard procedure. Then, Miles muttered, pulling a Slim Jim from his kit. Amelia stood back, her eyes scanning the hallway, a prickle of unease beginning to crawl up her spine. The silence felt watchful. With a soft click, the lock gave way. Miles pushed the door open slowly, revealing a maw of impenetrable darkness. He flicked on his powerful tactical flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating a small, cluttered living room. The apartment was neat, almost meticulously so, which struck Miles as odd for a man who had seemingly vanished without a trace. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with dusty tomes. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on a coffee table, a pen resting beside it. A teacup sat on a coaster, a faint ring of dried tea at the bottom. It was as if Arthur Finch had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. No signs of forced entry, Amelia observed, her voice hushed.
Nostragel.
It's like he just evaporated. Miles moved deeper into the apartment, his flashlight sweeping through the rooms. The kitchen was spotless, not a dish out of place. The bedroom was equally tidy, the bed neatly made. There was no note, no indication of where Finch might have gone. As they entered the bathroom, Amelia gasped. On the pristine white tile floor, directly in front of the bathtub, was a small, dark stain. It was almost invisible against the dark grout, but under the harsh beam of Miles's light, its reddish-brown hue was unmistakable. Blood, Miles stated, his voice grim. He knelt, examining it closely. Not much, a few drops. Oh, dried. But if there was no struggle, Amelia began, her brow furrowed. Exactly, Miles said, standing up. It doesn't fit. Unless he was injured and then left. They continued their search, a growing sense of dread settling over them. The apartment felt unnaturally cold, despite the temperate night outside. And that faint, metallic scent, it was stronger here, mixed with the cloying sweetness Miles had noticed in the lobby. In the study, a small, unassuming room filled with more books and a heavy wooden desk, Miles's flashlight beam fell upon a framed photograph. It was a picture of Arthur Finch, a mild-mannered man with kind eyes, standing beside a much younger woman, presumably his sister. But what caught Miles's attention was the background, a blurry image of the apartment building itself, the obsidian, and in one of the windows, barely discernible, was a faint, distorted face. A child's face. Miles frowned, leaning closer. Amelia, take a look at this. Amelia peered at the photo. It's just a reflection, Miles. Or maybe a smudge on the glass. Maybe, Miles conceded, but a chill ran down his spine. He had a bad feeling about this place. He moved to the desk, his light sweeping over its surface. A leather-bound journal lay open. Miles picked it up, his gloved fingers carefully turning the brittle pages. The handwriting was neat, precise. Finch's daily entries. As he read, a new layer of dread began to unfold. The early entries were mundane. Grocery lists, appointments, observations about the weather. But as the dates progressed, a subtle shift occurred. Finch began to write about the apartment, about the sounds he heard at night. Day 7. Heard a faint scratching in the walls tonight. Thought it was mice. Odd, for such a well-maintained building. Day 14. The scratching is louder and different, more rhythmic, like fingernails. Day 21. I hear whispers now, faint at first, but they're growing clearer. They call my name. They know my name. Miles's eyes darted to Amelia, who was now reading over his shoulder, her face pale. Day 28. The cold. It's always cold now, even when the heat is on full blast. And the smell, that sweet, sickening smell, like old flowers and something else, something metallic. Day 35. I saw them, in the shadows, just glimpses, elongated forms. They move when I'm not looking. They're always watching. The entries became more frantic, the handwriting more erratic. Day 42. They want me. They want to play. They want to take me to their game. I can hear the child's laughter now. So clear. So close. The last entry was dated 3 days ago, the day Arthur Finch was reported missing. Day 45. They're here. They're in the room. They're everywhere. The child, it's reaching for me. Its eyes are empty. I can't breathe. The game, it's starting. Miles closed the journal, his hand trembling. The silence in the apartment now felt suffocating, pregnant with unseen horrors. The cold was bone deep, and the sweet, metallic scent was overwhelming. Suddenly, a faint, childish giggle echoed from the hallway. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Miles and Amelia spun around, their flashlights darting frantically. The hallway was empty, but the giggles seemed to linger, a cold, mocking sound. "Miles," Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, from the bedroom, came a loud, guttural growl, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. Miles reacted instantly, pushing Amelia behind him. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice tight with adrenaline. He moved towards the bedroom, his flashlight beam cutting a path through the oppressive darkness. As he reached the doorway, the growling stopped. The dragging sound ceased. The room was plunged into an eerie silence. Miles cautiously stepped inside, his light sweeping the room. The bed was still neatly made. The furniture was undisturbed, but on the pristine white sheets, directly in the center of the bed, was a single, small wooden block. It was painted with a faded, childlike drawing of a stick figure with long, spindly limbs and empty, staring eyes. And next to it, the letter F. Miles felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He knew what that F stood for. Finch. He heard a strangled cry from behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Amelia was standing in the doorway, her face contorted in terror, her flashlight beam fixed on something in the living room. Miles rushed back, his own light following hers. In the middle of the living room, where moments before there had been nothing but empty space, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and where its face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of shadow. And beside it, a smaller, childlike figure, its eyes dark, empty, staring directly at them. The sweet, metallic scent was overpowering now, making Miles's eyes water, his stomach churn. The temperature plummeted, and he could see his own breath misting in the frigid air. The whispers began again, a cacophony of mournful voices, swirling around them, calling their names. Miles, Amelia. The figures began to advance, slowly, deliberately, their movements jerky and unnatural. The childlike figure raised a small, translucent hand, reaching out towards them. "Run!" Miles roared, grabbing Amelia's arm. They stumbled back, tripping over furniture, their flashlights clattering to the floor, plunging the room into near darkness. Only the faint, distorted light from the street lamps outside offered any illumination, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced with the advancing figures. They scrambled towards the front door, their hands fumbling with the jammed lock. The whispers grew louder, the growling more intense. The cold was unbearable, a physical weight pressing down on them. Miles finally managed to force the lock open with a desperate shove. They burst out into the hallway, gasping for breath, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They didn't look back. They ran, stumbling down the stairs, ignoring the elevator, their only thought to escape the suffocating horror of apartment 4B. They burst out into the street, gulping down the cool, clean night air. They didn't stop until they reached their unmarked car, fumbling with the keys, their hands shaking uncontrollably. Miles slammed the car into gear and sped away, leaving the obsidian behind, a dark, malevolent presence against the city lights. They drove in silence for a long time, the trauma of the night settling over them. When they finally pulled over on a quiet street, the first hint of dawn painting the sky, Amelia broke the silence, her voice trembling. What was that, Miles?" Miles stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know, Amelia. I've never seen anything like it." He paused, then added, his voice barely a whisper. "But I know one thing. Arthur Finch didn't just vanish. He was taken to play their game." He looked at Amelia, his eyes haunted. "And I think they wanted us to join." Amelia shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. The silence of apartment 4B, the sweet, metallic scent, the whispers, the empty eyes of the child. They would never truly leave them. They were marked, and the game they knew was far from over. The city lights of Neo-Viridia glittered like spilled jewels across the sprawling metropolis, a beacon of technological marvel and human ambition. Yet, beneath the dazzling facade, shadows clung to the forgotten corners, and in one such shadow, a horror stirred. Elias Thorne, a reclusive software engineer with a penchant for the arcane and the overlooked, found himself increasingly drawn to the city's underbelly, to the whispered tales of strange occurrences that the official news channels dismissed as urban myths or mass hysteria. His latest obsession was the burgeoning subculture of cosplay, where enthusiasts transformed themselves into fictional characters with astonishing detail. But Elias had heard a different kind of rumor, a chilling whisper of a cosplayer who was too perfect, whose transformations were unnervingly complete, whose very presence seemed to warp reality around her. Her name, or the name she used, was Serafina. She appeared at conventions like a phantom, materializing from the throngs of costumed revelers, her costumes breathtakingly intricate, her portrayal of characters so utterly convincing that she seemed to become them, rather than merely dress as them. Her movements were fluid, almost unnatural, her eyes holding a depth that was both captivating and unsettling, a gaze that seemed to pierce through the casual observer. Elias, a man who trusted algorithms and cold, hard data more than intuition, felt a prickle of unease whenever her name was mentioned. There was something in the way her admirers spoke of her, a fervor that bordered on obsession, a devotion that seemed almost compelled, as if their very wills were subtly bent to her presence. His investigation began subtly, a series of cross-referenced public records, social media profiles, and obscure online forums. Serafina had no digital footprint before 3 years ago. No family, no schooling, no birth certificate, no past. She simply appeared, fully formed, a dazzling enigma, a star born from nothing. Her online presence was a curated masterpiece of perfection. Each photo, each video, a testament to her flawless artistry, her seemingly effortless ability to embody any character. Yet, the more Elias delved, the more inconsistencies he found. A slight flicker in her eyes in one video, a momentary stiffness in her smile in another, almost imperceptible to the casual viewer, but enough to trigger his finely tuned sense of anomaly, his innate ability to spot the glitch in the matrix. The first real clue came from a deleted forum post, salvaged from the digital graveyard of forgotten data. It spoke of a small, isolated research facility, deep within the old city's abandoned industrial district, rumored to have experimented with biomimicry and advanced parasitic organisms. The facility had been shut down decades ago after a containment breach, the details of which were conveniently scrubbed from official records, leaving only a tantalizing void. The post mentioned a specific project, Project Chimera, aimed at creating a perfect, adaptable biological weapon, a parasite capable of mimicking any host, down to its cellular structure, a living, breathing chameleon. Elias's blood ran cold. He remembered a childhood nightmare, a recurring dream of something slithering beneath his skin, wearing his face, a silent, insidious horror. The connection, though tenuous, sparked a chilling recognition. He began to attend the conventions where Serafina appeared, not as a fan, but as a silent, meticulous shadow. He observed her from a distance, then closer, blending into the background, a ghost among the costumed revelers. Her beauty was undeniable, almost otherworldly, a magnetic pull that drew all eyes. But the closer he got, the more he saw, the more the subtle imperfections became apparent. The subtle tremor in her hand when she reached for a drink, a fleeting rigidity in her neck, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in her skin under certain lights, like heat haze distorting the air. It was like looking at a masterpiece painted on a canvas that was subtly, almost imperceptibly, warping, its very essence shifting. The scent was the most unsettling, a faint, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, but with an underlying metallic tang, like old pennies or dried blood. It was subtle, expertly masked by her expensive perfumes, but Elias's heightened senses, honed by years of late-night coding and obsessive focus, picked it up, a discordant note in the symphony of the convention hall. It was the scent of something not quite right, something organic but fundamentally alien, something that defied the natural order. He learned her schedule, her habits, her meticulously planned existence. She lived in a high-rise apartment, a penthouse suite overlooking the city, a stark contrast to her humble, non-existent origins. She had no friends, no intimate relationships, no casual acquaintances. Her life revolved solely around her cosplay, her public appearances, her meticulous transformations. It was a performance, a constant, elaborate charade, a life lived entirely in character. One night, driven by an insatiable, terrifying curiosity, Elias followed her to her apartment. He scaled the building, using his specialized climbing gear, a skill he had honed during his calculated escapes from various unsavory situations. He breached her high-tech security system with practiced ease, slipping inside like a phantom, leaving no trace of his intrusion. The apartment was immaculate, sterile, almost devoid of personal touches. It was like a showroom, not a home, a temporary stage for a constant performance. He found her in her dressing room, a vast space filled with elaborate costumes, wigs, and makeup, all meticulously organized, each a discarded skin. She was sitting at a vanity, her back to him, removing her latest costume, a fantastical elven queen, complete with flowing robes and intricate prosthetics. As she peeled away the layers of fabric, Elias saw it. Not a young woman, but something else. Something utterly alien and horrifying. Her skin, as she slowly removed the costume, seemed to ripple, to shift, like water under a thin membrane. Her limbs, once slender and graceful, seemed to subtly elongate, her joints clicking with an unnatural, wet sound, a sound of bone and cartilage reshaping. The faint metallic scent intensified, becoming overwhelming, nauseating, filling the air. Her hair, a cascade of golden curls, seemed to flatten, to recede, to dissolve, revealing a scalp that was strangely smooth, almost translucent, like stretched parchment. He saw the true horror in the reflection of the vanity mirror. It wasn't Seraphina. It was a grotesque parody of a human form. Her face, as she slowly turned, was a mask of stretched, pale flesh, her features pulled taut, distorted. Her eyes, wide and black, devoid of pupils, reflected the room like obsidian pools, twin abysses of pure, predatory hunger. Her mouth, impossibly wide, was filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, glistening with a viscous, clear fluid, like dew on a spiderweb. Her body was a mass of undulating, shifting flesh, a pale, almost translucent entity, barely holding its human shape, a constant struggle against its own amorphous nature. The costume, the wigs, the makeup, they were merely a thin veil, a meticulously crafted disguise, a fragile illusion over a monstrous reality. The whispers began then, not from the room, but from within his own mind, a chorus of dry, rasping voices devoid of emotion, yet filled with a chilling hunger, a collective consciousness invading his thoughts. You see us, you understand. We are the perfect form. We are legion, and you are merely a vessel. Terror, cold and absolute, seized Elias, a primal scream trapped in his throat. He was looking at Project Chimera, not a single parasite, but a collective, a hive mind, a living, adaptable entity that had consumed its original host and now wore her skin like a costume, a trophy. It had perfected its mimicry, its deception, its ability to blend seamlessly into the human world. The creature, the Seraphina entity, slowly rose from the vanity, its movements fluid, unnatural, its limbs elongating, its true form struggling to contain itself within the human shell, the skin stretching taut, threatening to tear. The faint slosh 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 he had heard in the swamp, the rhythmic dragging sound, echoed in his memory, a terrifying parallel. This was the same kind of horror, a primal, consuming entity that wore the skin of its victims, a silent, insidious predator. You are a threat, the entity rasped, its voice a chilling parody of Seraphina's melodic tones, 1,000 voices speaking as one, a chorus of alien intelligence. You will be assimilated. You will become part of us. Your knowledge, your memories, your very being will be ours. It lunged, its amorphous form surging forward, tendrils of pale, shimmering flesh reaching for him like hungry serpents, its obsidian eyes fixed on his. The whispers intensified, a chorus of temptation and despair, trying to break his will, to make him surrender, to drag him into its embrace, to consume him utterly. Elias dodged, his movements a blur of desperate evasion, his mind racing, searching for a weakness, a way to fight something that was not truly physical, something that defied all logic. He remembered a fragment of an old scientific paper he had salvaged from a discarded hard drive, a theoretical concept from Project Chimera, a desperate, last-ditch effort to contain the uncontainable. Extreme sonic frequencies can disrupt cellular cohesion in certain parasitic organisms, particularly those with a highly adaptable, fluid structure. Sonic frequencies, sound, a defiant pulse against the alien silence. He fought with a desperate ferocity, not against the physical form of the entity, which was intangible, but against the despair it radiated, against the whispers that clawed at his sanity, trying to unravel his mind. He scrambled for his backpack, fumbling for his portable sonic emitter, a device he had built for disrupting surveillance systems, never imagining he would use it against something so utterly monstrous, so utterly alien. The entity shrieked, a sound like tearing flesh and grinding bone, 1,000 tortured voices screaming in unison, its amorphous form twisting and contorting, its tendrils lashing wildly. The drowned, the spectral forms from his swamp nightmare, flashed in his mind, a terrifying parallel. This was a different kind of drowned, a biological one, a living, breathing nightmare. He activated the sonic emitter, cranking the frequency to its highest, most piercing setting. A high-pitched, agonizing whine filled the room, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, vibrating through his bones, through the very air. The entity recoiled, its form flickering violently, its whispers turning into a cacophony of pained shrieks, 1,000 tormented voices crying out in agony, unable to bear the sound. The sonic frequency, a defiant pulse of human technology, a testament to human ingenuity, was anathema to its parasitic existence, a burning light against its shadow, a force it could not comprehend or endure. The Seraphina entity shrieked one last, agonizing time, a sound that seemed to shatter the very air. Its amorphous form twisted and contorted, the pale, stretched skin of its human disguise ripping and tearing, revealing the pulsating, translucent mass beneath, a horrifying glimpse of its true, monstrous nature. It dissolved, sinking into a viscous, shimmering puddle on the polished floor, fading into nothingness like mist in the morning sun, leaving only a faint, metallic residue. The whispers died into a profound, liberating silence. Elias stood panting, his body trembling uncontrollably, his mind reeling from the ordeal, the phantom chill still clinging to his skin. The air was still, the metallic scent gone, replaced by the sterile smell of the apartment, a clean, empty scent that offered no comfort. He had survived. He had broken the mimic in the mirror. He never looked at cosplay the same way again. The thrill of anonymity was gone, replaced by the chilling memory of the parasitic entity, the knowledge that such horrors existed, hidden in plain sight. He left Neo-Viridia, walking for days, pushing himself until he reached the harsh, comforting cacophony of a bustling, old-world city, seeking solace in the mundane, in the comforting predictability of human life, in the anonymity of crowds. He never spoke of what he had seen, what he had fought. Who would believe him? They would call him mad, just another victim of urban paranoia. But sometimes, late at night, when the city sounds faded and the silence pressed in, he would hear it a faint, almost imperceptible slosh, 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 like something dragging itself through thick mud, and a chilling, high-pitched giggle just at the edge of hearing, a sound that seemed to echo from the deepest recesses of his memory. He knew the entity was gone, its immediate threat neutralized, but the chilling knowledge of its existence, and the possibility of others like it, of other perfect forms lurking in the shadows, would forever haunt him. And he knew that somewhere, In the vast, unseen corners of the world, the mimic in the mirror still lingered, its insidious whispers waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to fall into its embrace, unaware that some disguises, once donned, never truly come off, and some horrors, once glimpsed, can never be unseen. The air in Willow Creek had always been thick with unspoken tensions, a quiet hum beneath the surface of polite smiles and shared potlucks. But when the Great Divide truly began, it wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, insidious rot, seeping into every crack of the community. Sarah Vance, a woman whose roots in this land ran as deep as the ancient oaks, felt it keenly. Her conservatism wasn't just a political stance. It was a way of life, a reverence for tradition, for self-reliance, for the unyielding principles she believed had built this nation. The men who now held sway in Willow Creek, a new wave of urban transplants with their progressive ideals and their disdain for the old ways, saw her as an anachronism, a relic to be swept aside. Started subtly. Disagreements at town meetings turned into heated arguments. Fences were erected not just around properties, but around ideologies. Then came the re-education initiatives, the mandatory community workshops on inclusive thought, the quiet shunning of those who didn't conform. Sarah, with her sharp mind and sharper tongue, became a symbol of resistance, a thorn in their collective side. She refused to attend their workshops, refused to change her views, refused to be silenced. The night the power grid failed, a strange, unnatural darkness descended upon Willow Creek, not just from the lack of electricity, but from a deeper, more primal fear. The news reports, crackling faintly on battery-powered radios, spoke of widespread outages, of civil unrest in the cities, of a nation teetering on the brink. Here, in the isolated valley, it felt like the end of the world. The men of the New Order, as they now called themselves, saw it as an opportunity. Led by a charismatic, self-proclaimed philosopher named Marcus Thorne, they began to consolidate power. They seized the town hall, the general store, and the meager supply of emergency generators. Their rhetoric, once veiled, became overt. Those who resisted their vision of a harmonious, progressive society would be dealt with. Sarah knew what that meant. She had seen the glint in Marcus's eyes, the fanaticism that had replaced reason. She had prepared. Her small, isolated farm, nestled deep in the woods, was a fortress of her own making. She had stocked provisions, sharpened her hunting knives, and, most importantly, cleaned and loaded the old Winchester rifle her grandfather had left her. She wasn't just a conservative woman. She was a survivor, forged in the crucible of hard work and an unshakable belief in her right to exist on her own terms. The first knock came on the third night of darkness. It was a soft, insistent rap on her sturdy oak door. Sarah stood in the shadows of her living room, the Winchester cradled in her arms, its cold steel a comforting weight. Through a crack in the curtains, she saw them, 3 men, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Marcus Thorne was among them, his lean frame radiating an unsettling confidence. Sarah, Marcus's voice, amplified by the stillness of the night, carried an unnerving calm. "We know you're in there. Come out. It's time to join the community. For your own good." Sarah remained silent. She knew their community was a cage, their good a euphemism for submission. "Don't be foolish." Another voice, harsher, cut in. "We have ways of making you see reason." A chill snaked down Sarah's spine, but it wasn't fear. It was a cold, resolute anger. She had fought for her beliefs her entire life, and she wasn't about to surrender them to these self-appointed tyrants. "This is my home," she called out, her voice steady, betraying none of the tension coiling within her. "And I will defend it." A moment of silence, then Marcus's soft chuckle. "As you wish, Sarah. But understand, the old ways are dead. Progress demands sacrifice." The men retreated into the shadows. Sarah knew they wouldn't leave. They would return, and they would be less polite. She spent the night patrolling her property, the crunch of leaves under her boots the only sound in the oppressive darkness. Her senses were heightened. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, sending a jolt through her. She was a hunter now and the hunted. The real assault began at dawn. They came from the woods, a dozen of them, their faces grim, their movements coordinated. They carried crude weapons, axes, clubs, even a few rusty pitchforks. Marcus, standing at the edge of the tree line, held a megaphone. "Sarah Vance!" His voice boomed, distorted and menacing. "This is your final warning. Surrender now, and we will be lenient." Sarah raised the Winchester, aiming it at the sky, and fired a single shot. The crack echoed through the valley, a defiant roar against their threats. Marcus's face hardened. "Then you have chosen your fate." He gestured, and the men surged forward. Sarah had anticipated this. She had dug shallow trenches, laid out tripwires, and strategically placed thorny bushes around her property. The first few men stumbled, caught in her traps, their shouts of surprise quickly turning to curses of pain. She picked off 2 more with well-aimed shots, not to kill, but to wound, to sow chaos and fear. The men, disoriented, hesitated. They had expected an easy victory, a quick subjugation of an old woman. They hadn't expected resistance, let alone such calculated defiance. Marcus, enraged, bellowed orders, pushing them forward. "Don't falter. She's just one woman." But Sarah was more than just one woman. She was the embodiment of everything they sought to erase. Resilience, independence, the fierce spirit of a free individual. She moved with a practiced grace, darting between cover, her rifle spitting fire, her movements economical and precise. She was a veteran in her own right, a warrior in a different kind of war. One man, a burly brute named Kevin, managed to breach her outer defenses. He charged towards her, an axe raised high. Sarah waited, her eyes cold and focused. As he closed the distance, she dropped to one knee, aimed and fired. The bullet struck him in the leg, sending him sprawling with a howl of pain. The battle raged for hours. Sarah, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a desperate ferocity. She used the terrain to her advantage, disappearing into the dense foliage, reappearing in unexpected places, her shots forcing them back, keeping them off balance. She was a phantom, a whisper in the wind, a nightmare for those who sought to control her. As the day wore on, the men grew frustrated, their initial confidence replaced by exhaustion and fear. They had lost several of their own, either wounded or too demoralized to continue. Marcus, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes burning with a desperate fury, realized he had underestimated her. He called for a retreat. The remaining men, battered and defeated, stumbled back into the woods, leaving behind a trail of blood and broken pride. Sarah watched them go, her chest heaving, the acrid smell of gunpowder clinging to the air. She had won the first battle, but she knew it wasn't over. Marcus Thorne was not a man who accepted defeat. Days turned into a tense standoff. Sarah remained vigilant, her farm a silent island in a sea of hostility. She saw their patrols, heard their distant shouts, felt their constant surveillance. They were trying to starve her out, to break her will through isolation. But Sarah Vance's will was not easily broken. She had lived through droughts, blizzards, and personal tragedies. This was just another challenge. She rationed her supplies, hunted small game in the woods, and tended to her small garden, a defiant act of normalcy in a world gone mad. One night, the whispers began again, not the spectral kind, but the real ones carried on the wind. She heard them, faint at first, then growing louder, the voices of women. They were coming from the direction of the town. Curiosity, a dangerous emotion, gnawed at her. She grabbed her rifle, a small pack, and slipped out into the darkness. She moved through the woods like a shadow, her senses alert. She found them at the edge of Willow Creek, a group of women huddled together, their faces pale and drawn in the faint moonlight. They were the wives and daughters of the men who had attacked her, women who had been forced to endure Marcus Thorne's new order. They were whispering, their voices filled with fear and desperation. Sarah listened, hidden in the shadows. They spoke of forced labor, of meager rations, of their men becoming increasingly brutal and paranoid. They spoke of their children being taken to re-education camps in the old schoolhouse. They spoke of a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan to escape, to fight back. One woman, a timid librarian named Martha, spoke with a newfound courage. "We can't live like this anymore. We have to do something." Sarah Vance. She fought them. She showed us it's possible. A spark ignited within Sarah. She wasn't alone. Her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for them, for the soul of Willow Creek. She revealed herself, stepping out of the shadows. The women gasped, startled. Then their fear turned to awe. "I can help you," Sarah said, her voice low and firm, "but it will be dangerous. Are you willing to fight?" A murmur went through the group, then a chorus of determined nods. They were tired of living in fear. They were ready to fight. Sarah led them back to her farm, a silent procession of rebellion. She taught them what she knew: how to move silently through the woods, how to set simple traps, how to use makeshift weapons. She showed them how to load and aim the rifle, though she kept it for herself, knowing its power was too great for untrained hands. She instilled in them a sense of purpose, a belief in their own strength. The plan was simple, audacious, and terrifying. They would strike at dawn, when the men were least expecting it. They would target the town hall where Marcus Thorne and his inner circle slept, and the schoolhouse where the children were held. The night before the attack was filled with a nervous energy. Sarah sharpened her knives, her mind clear, her resolve unyielding. She looked at the faces of the women around her, some young, some old, all united by a common enemy. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about survival, about freedom, about reclaiming their lives. The attack was swift and brutal. Sarah, leading the charge, moved like a ghost through the pre-dawn gloom. She disabled the sentries with practiced ease, her knife finding its mark with chilling precision. The other women, emboldened by her example, moved with a newfound courage, their improvised weapons striking true. They burst into the town hall, catching Marcus Thorne and his men by surprise. The fight was chaotic, a desperate struggle in the flickering light of lanterns. Sarah, her rifle blazing, engaged Marcus directly. He was a fanatic, but he was also a coward, his philosophical pronouncements crumbling in the face of real violence. He lunged at her, a desperate, wild swing with a heavy club. Sarah dodged, her movements fluid, and brought the butt of her rifle crashing down on his head. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Meanwhile, the other women, fueled by years of suppressed rage, overwhelmed the remaining men. The fight was messy, brutal, but ultimately decisive. The men of the new order were defeated, their reign of terror brought to an end by the very people they had sought to control. At the schoolhouse, the women found their children, terrified but unharmed. The reunion was tearful, a mix of relief and lingering trauma. As the sun rose over Willow Creek, casting long, golden rays over the quiet valley, Sarah stood amidst the wreckage, her face grim but resolute. The battle was won, but the war for their community, for their way of life, had just begun. There would be rebuilding, healing, and the difficult task of forging a new path forward, one built on genuine community, not forced conformity. Sarah Vance, the conservative woman who had fought liberal men to the death, had not just defended her home. She had sparked a revolution, a quiet uprising in the heart of a forgotten valley. She had shown them that true freedom was not given, but earned, sometimes with blood, always with an unyielding spirit. And as the people of Willow Creek began to pick up the pieces, they knew that the echoes of her defiance would resonate through the valley for generations to come, a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked ideology and the enduring power of a woman who refused to be silenced. The scars of the conflict would remain, etched into the landscape and the souls of those who lived through it, a testament to the dark side of division and the terrifying lengths to which humans can go when their beliefs clash. The quiet hum of tension in Willow Creek had been replaced by a fragile peace, a peace born of fire and blood, forever haunted by the specter of what had almost been lost. The train car was a coffin on wheels, a suffocating metal box crammed with bodies pressed so close that breathing became a collective, desperate effort. Each gasp for air was a shared agony, each exhalation a cloud of fear and stale breath. Elias, a scholar whose life had once been defined by the quiet rustle of ancient texts, the scent of aged parchment, and the serene solitude of his study, now found his world reduced to the rhythmic, hypnotic clatter of the wheels on the tracks and the acrid, cloying stench of fear, unwashed humanity, and something else, something vaguely metallic like old blood. Each jolt of the carriage was a hammer blow against his dwindling hope, a physical manifestation of the relentless journey into the unknown. They were heading east, deeper into the heart of a continent consumed by madness, deeper into the maw of the war, a journey from which few returned. Whispers, thin and brittle as old paper, circulated through the cramped space, passed from trembling lip to trembling ear. Auschwitz, work camp, re-education, resettlement. No one dared speak the true, unspoken terror that lurked beneath those euphemisms, the chilling reality that gnawed at their collective consciousness. When the doors finally groaned open, a blast of frigid, biting air, thick with the smell of ash, human waste, and that same metallic tang, assaulted them. It was a physical blow, stealing their breath, stinging their eyes. The sky above was a perpetual, suffocating gray, a vast, oppressive blanket that pressed down on a landscape of stark, skeletal trees, endless rows of barbed wire fences, menacing watchtowers with their cold, unblinking eyes, and a sprawling, desolate expanse of barracks that stretched to the horizon. This was not a place of work, not a place of re-education. It was a place of systematic dehumanization, a factory of despair, designed to break the spirit before it broke the body. The first horror was the silence. Not the serene silence of peace or the comforting quiet of a library, but a heavy, unnatural quiet, a profound absence of human sound, broken only by the barked, guttural commands of the guards, the distant clang of metal on metal, and the shuffling, dragging cadence of thousands of defeated feet. It was the silence of suppressed screams, of unspoken agony, of souls slowly being extinguished, a silence that hummed with unshed tears and unvoiced prayers. Elias was stripped of his name, his clothes, his dignity. He became a number, a series of digits tattooed onto his forearm, a brand of ownership, a mark of his reduction from a man to an item. His days merged into an endless, monotonous cycle of grueling, senseless labor, meager, watery rations that barely sustained life, and the constant, gnawing fear of the unknown, the ever-present threat of arbitrary violence or sudden, inexplicable disappearance. The guards, with their impassive faces and their cold, dead eyes, were not human. They were extensions of the camp itself, instruments of its insidious will, devoid of empathy or mercy. Their boots crunched on the gravel, a sound that became synonymous with terror. But the true horror Elias soon discovered was not just the physical torment, the hunger, the cold, the beatings. It was the insidious, creeping dread that permeated every fiber of the camp, a psychological miasma that slowly, relentlessly eroded the mind, stripping away hope, reason, and eventually, identity itself. It was the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and deepen, even in broad daylight, coiling around the barracks like hungry serpents, clinging to the watchtowers like grotesque gargoyles. It was the faint, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to drift on the wind, just at the edge of hearing. When no one was speaking, a dry, rustling sound that seemed to carry ancient secrets. He started noticing things, small at first, easily dismissed. The faces of the prisoners, already gaunt and hollow, seemed to subtly shift in the dim, flickering light of the barracks, their eyes sometimes reflecting a fleeting, unnatural gleam, a spark that was not of this world. The numbers tattooed on their arms, he swore, sometimes pulsed faintly, as if with an internal, malevolent energy, a silent, living brand. He dismissed it as exhaustion, as the slow unraveling of his own sanity in this hellish environment, a defense mechanism of a mind pushed to its breaking point. One night, huddled on his hard bunk, shivering despite the meager blanket, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. They were not words, not yet, but a cacophony of dry rustles, faint clicks, and something that sounded uncannily like stifled laughter. A cruel, mocking sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the barracks, from the cold, damp earth beneath, from the very air itself. The air around him grew noticeably colder, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into his very marrow, even with the feeble warmth of his own breath. He saw them then, in the deepest shadows of the barracks, at the periphery of his vision. Vague, humanoid forms, shimmering distortions in the air, barely perceptible, like heat haze on a summer road, but undeniably present. They were like the shadows themselves, but with a chilling sentience, a malevolent awareness. They moved silently, drifting between the sleeping forms, their presence radiating an ancient, malevolent cold that seeped into his very bones, a profound sense of despair and forgotten rage. These were the echoes, as the oldest prisoners whispered in hushed, terrified tones, their voices barely audible above the sounds of their own trembling. The remnants of those who had died here, not just physically, but spiritually. Their souls trapped by the sheer weight of despair, by the unholy energy of the camp, by the countless atrocities committed within its fences, bound to this place, unable to find rest, condemned to an eternal torment. They were the silent witnesses, the eternal sufferers, and now something more. They were the camp's true inhabitants, its silent, unseen wardens, its spectral wardens. They were the ones who ensured no one truly escaped, not even in death, for death here was merely a transition to a different kind of imprisonment. The echoes were drawn to fear, to despair, to the raw, unfiltered agony of the living. They fed on it, growing stronger, more defined, their forms coalescing from mere distortions into almost solid apparitions. They were the camp's true inhabitants, its silent, unseen wardens, its malevolent heart. They were the ones who ensured no one truly escaped, not even in death, for death here was merely a transition to a different kind of imprisonment. Elias tried to rationalize it. Hallucinations, sleep deprivation, the mind's desperate attempt to cope with unimaginable horror, to create a tangible enemy in a world of intangible terror. But the cold was real, the whispers were real, and the growing sense of being watched, constantly, relentlessly, by unseen eyes, was terrifyingly, irrevocably real. The echoes began to interact, not physically, but subtly, insidiously. A prisoner might suddenly stumble, as if pushed by an unseen hand, falling into the mud or against a barbed wire fence. A meager ration of bread, clutched desperately, might vanish from a starving man's grasp, only to reappear, untouched, in a distant corner. A whispered secret, a desperate confession, might be repeated, chillingly accurately, by someone who couldn't possibly have heard it, their eyes wide with terror and confusion. They were the camp's unseen manipulators, its insidious puppet masters, pulling invisible strings, amplifying the suffering, orchestrating the despair. One night, a new prisoner, a young man named Samuel, arrived. He was defiant, his eyes still holding a spark of hope, a flicker of rebellion, a vibrant defiance that stood out starkly against the prevailing gloom. Elias saw the echoes gather around him, drawn to his vibrant, untainted spirit like moths to a flame, their forms shimmering with a renewed intensity. They whispered to him, unseen, unheard by others, weaving insidious doubts, planting seeds of despair, twisting his thoughts, eroding his will. Samuel's hope slowly withered, replaced by a profound, crushing hopelessness that settled over him like a shroud. Within a week, he was just another shuffling, hollow-eyed shell, his spark extinguished, his spirit broken, ready to join the silent ranks of the echoes. Elias understood then. The camp didn't just kill the body, it killed the soul. It was a spiritual charnel house, and the echoes were the instruments of that spiritual death, ensuring a fresh supply of tormented spirits to join their ranks, to swell their numbers, to perpetuate the cycle of despair. He realized he had to fight, not just for his physical life, which was fleeting, but for his very essence, for the integrity of his soul. He started to resist the despair, to cling to memories of sunlight, of laughter, of the scent of his books, of the warmth of his wife's hand in his. He would recite poetry in his mind, lines from Homer or Virgil, sing forgotten songs from his childhood. Anything to create a flicker of light, a spark of life within himself that the echoes could not consume, a bastion against their encroaching darkness. The echoes hated it. Their whispers intensified, turning into a cacophony of dry, angry snarls, 1,000 discordant voices trying to drown out his thoughts, to shatter his resolve. They would press in on him, their cold presence suffocating, trying to crush his spirit, to force him to abandon hope. He would wake in the dead of night, feeling spectral hands on his throat, trying to choke the life out of him, not physically, but spiritually trying to steal his breath, his will to live. One freezing morning, during roll call, as the biting wind whipped through the ranks of shivering prisoners, a guard singled out a frail, elderly man for punishment, his face contorted in a sneer. The guard's face was impassive, a mask of cold indifference, but Elias saw something else, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer around the guard, a subtle distortion in the air, a faint glow in his eyes. The echoes were influencing them, subtly guiding their cruelty, amplifying their malevolence, turning them into unwitting tools of their spiritual torment. The camp was a symbiotic horror, the living guards and the spectral echoes working in concert to break the prisoners, body and soul. Elias knew he couldn't escape the camp physically. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, the armed guards, the sheer exhaustion, they were insurmountable barriers. But he could try to escape the echoes, to deny them his soul, to preserve his inner light. He began to share his memories, his stories, his fragments of hope with the few prisoners he trusted, those whose eyes still held a glimmer of something human. He would whisper tales of beauty, of love, of a world beyond the barbed wire, of art and music and freedom, trying to ignite a flicker of defiance in their own dying spirits, to remind them of what they were, what they had been. The echoes retaliated with renewed fury. The whispers became screams in his mind, 1,000 tormented voices trying to drown out his thoughts, to drive him mad. He would find himself inexplicably drawn to dangerous tasks, to places where the guards were most brutal, where the risk of death was highest. He knew they were trying to force him into a situation where his spirit would finally break, where he would succumb to despair and join them, another tortured soul in their eternal prison. One bitter evening, as the snow fell like ashes, coating the camp in a shroud of white, Elias was tasked with clearing a frozen ditch, the ice biting at his exposed skin. He was weak, shivering uncontrollably, his body screaming in protest with every movement. The echoes were all around him, their cold presence overwhelming, their whispers a deafening roar in his mind, a chorus of temptation and despair. Give up, Elias. Join us. There is no escape, only oblivion, only peace in the darkness. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, not physical, but an intense, crushing despair that threatened to consume him, to snuff out his last spark of life. He saw the faces of his loved ones, fading, blurring, as the echoes tried to erase them from his memory, to sever his last ties to life, to humanity. But then, a memory, sharp and vivid, cut through the haze of pain and despair. The scent of his wife's perfume, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the warmth of their embrace. A defiant spark ignited within him, a fierce, burning ember of hope, a refusal to yield. He would not give them that. He would not surrender his soul. He began to sing, a low, ragged murmur at first, barely audible above the wind, then growing stronger, a forgotten lullaby from his childhood, a melody of love and innocence. His voice was hoarse, broken, raw with emotion, but it was his voice, a sound of life, a defiant act of creation in a place of systematic destruction. The echoes recoiled, their whispers turned into pained shrieks, their forms flickering, dissolving like mist in the wind, unable to withstand the pure, unadulterated sound of life. The music, a vibrant pulse of life, a melody of human connection, was anathema to their spectral existence, a burning light against their shadow, a force they could not comprehend or endure. The guards, drawn by the strange, defiant sound, approached, their rifles raised. Elias continued to sing, his eyes fixed on the gray, oppressive sky, his voice a defiant beacon against the encroaching darkness. A guard raised his rifle, his face impassive, his finger tightening on the trigger. But as he looked at Elias, something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of confusion, a momentary hesitation, a brief crack in the cold mask. The echo's influence, weakened by Elias's defiance, was momentarily broken, their hold over the living momentarily severed. The shot rang out, sharp and final, echoing across the frozen landscape. Elias fell, the cold earth rising to meet him, a final, brutal embrace. As his vision blurred, he saw the gray sky, and for a fleeting moment, a patch of brilliant, impossible blue, a glimpse of the world beyond the wire. He felt the cold embrace of death, but it was not the cold of the echoes. It was the cold of release, of peace, of freedom. His body lay in the snow, another number, another statistic in the camp's grim ledger. But his spirit, unbroken, soared, a defiant spark against the eternal gray. The echoes shrieked in frustration, their whispers turning into a chorus of impotent rage, their spectral forms writhing in torment. They had tried to claim him, but he had denied them. He had escaped their grasp, his soul untainted by their despair, a victory won in the face of absolute horror. The camp continued its grim work. More trains arrived, more numbers were tattooed, more souls were slowly extinguished. The echoes still lingered, drawn to the fear, feeding on the despair. Their whispers a constant, chilling presence, an eternal torment. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the barbed wire, carrying the scent of ash and despair, the oldest prisoners, those who had seen too much, those who clung to the last vestiges of hope, would swear they heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible melody, a snippet of a lullaby carried on the wind, a sound that seemed to defy the very nature of the camp. It was a sound of defiance, a whisper of hope, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, even in a place designed to crush all spirit, some spirits could not be broken. And that even in a place designed to extinguish all life, some echoes fought back, not to torment, but to remind those who remained that true death was not of the body, but of the soul. And that, they knew, was a fate far more terrifying than the camp itself. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, a relentless, drumming curtain that blurred the lines between sky and swamp. Private Miller, his uniform a sodden second skin, cursed under his breath as another cold drop found its way down his collar. His boots squelched with every step, each movement a struggle against the sucking mud that threatened to swallow them whole. Around him, the other members of Bravo Company moved like specters, their faces grim, their rifles clutched tight. "Any sign, Sergeant?" Miller rasped, his voice hoarse from the damp and the constant strain. Sergeant Thorne, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of 100 campaigns, merely shook his head. "Nothing but the damn frogs, Miller. And the silence. The silence. That was the real horror. Not the silence of a battlefield after the guns had fallen quiet, but a deeper, more profound quiet. The swamp should have been alive with the chirps of insects, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant cries of birds. But here, in this particular stretch of the Blackwater Mire, there was only the ceaseless patter of rain and the chorus of the frogs. They were everywhere, not the small, harmless tree frogs or the plump, croaking bullfrogs of home. These were different, larger, for one, some the size of a man's fist, others almost as big as his head. Their skin was a mottled, sickly green, slick with mucus, and their eyes were the worst. Luminous, golden orbs that seemed to glow in the perpetual twilight of the swamp. Unblinking, unervingly intelligent. They watched, from lily pads, from the gnarled roots of cypress trees, from beneath fallen logs. Always watching. The first incident had been a week ago. Private Jenkins, a nervous kid fresh out of basic, had gone to relieve himself behind a thicket of reeds. They'd heard his scream, a choked, gurgling sound that had sent a shiver down every man's spine. When they found him, he was sprawled face down in the shallow water, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth agape. And clinging to his face, a dozen of the large, green frogs, their bodies twitching, their long, sticky tongues flicking in and out of his open mouth. Thorn had shot them off, one by one, their bodies exploding in a spray of green ichor and bone. But the image of Jenkins's vacant stare, and the way the frogs had seemed to be feeding, had haunted their nightmares ever since. They tried to report it, but command had dismissed it as swamp fever, a hallucination brought on by the oppressive humidity and the psychological stress of the mission. "Keep moving, Bravo," the crackle on the radio had said. "Locate the objective." "No deviations." The objective, a downed reconnaissance drone, deep within enemy territory. A simple retrieval mission, they'd been told. But the swamp had other plans. As they pushed deeper, the air grew thicker, heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and acrid. The frog chorus intensified, a throbbing, guttural hum that vibrated in their bones, a sound that felt less like an animal call and more like a ritualistic chant. Specialist Davies, a quiet, stoic man who rarely showed fear, suddenly stumbled. He let out a choked cry, clutching his leg. "Something bit me. God, it burns." Miller dropped to his knees, shining his tactical light on Davies's shin. A large, dark red whelp was rapidly swelling, and a single, particularly enormous frog, its skin almost black, was hopping away into the murky water. "It's just a bite, Davies," Thorne said, trying to sound reassuring, but his voice lacked conviction. "We'll get you patched up." But Davies was already convulsing, his eyes rolling back in his head. Foam frothed at his lips. His skin began to take on a greenish tint, his veins bulging like thick cords beneath the surface. His fingers clawed at the mud, his body writhing in an unnatural dance. He's changing," Miller whispered, horrified. It was true. Davies's skin was growing slicker, his features distorting. His eyes, once human, were widening, turning a sickly yellow. A low, wet croak escaped his throat. Not his own voice, but something alien. Thorne, his face pale, raised his rifle. "I'm sorry, son." The shot echoed through the swamp, a stark punctuation mark to the amphibian chorus. Davies went still, a grotesque parody of a man, half human, half frog. The frogs around them, however, did not scatter. Instead, their calls grew louder, more insistent, as if in triumph. They buried Davies quickly, shallowly, the mud refusing to yield. The rain continued, washing away the evidence, but not the terror. Days bled into nights. The drone remained elusive, their rations dwindled, and the frogs were always there. They no longer merely watched. They seemed to anticipate their movements, appearing suddenly on their path, blocking their way, their golden eyes fixed on them with an unnerving intensity. Private Rodriguez, a devout man who carried a worn Bible in his pack, began to talk to himself, muttering prayers, then curses. He swore the frogs were whispering to him, promising him release, promising him a new form. One morning, Miller awoke to find Rodriguez gone. His rifle lay discarded in the mud, and a trail of large, webbed footprints led away from their makeshift camp, deeper into the swamp. They followed, their hearts pounding. The footprints led them to a clearing, where the trees grew unnaturally twisted, their branches draped with thick, phosphorescent moss. In the center of the clearing was a pool of black, stagnant water, shimmering with an unholy light. And there, at the edge of the pool, was Rodriguez. But it wasn't Rodriguez. His body was bloated, his limbs elongated, his skin a mottled green. His mouth was a wide, lipless slit, and his eyes, once filled with human fear, now glowed with the same unsettling golden light as the other frogs. He was surrounded by dozens of them, all croaking, all watching. He turned his head, a slow, unnatural movement, and fixed his new amphibian gaze upon them. A low, wet chuckle, devoid of humanity, emanated from his throat. Thorn didn't hesitate this time. He opened fire, a burst from his automatic rifle tearing through the grotesque form that had once been their comrade. The frogs scattered, a green wave receding into the shadows. "We have to get out of here," Miller choked, his stomach churning. "This place is cursed." "We can't," Thorn said, his voice grim. "Orders. The drone. The drone." It had become a phantom, a reason to stay in this living nightmare. They found it eventually, nestled in a clearing choked with strange, bulbous fungi. It was intact, miraculously, its metallic shell gleaming dully in the perpetual gloom. But as they approached, the ground around it began to ripple. The fungi pulsed with a faint, internal light. And then they emerged, not just the frogs, but something else. Larger, much larger. From beneath the earth, from the depths of the black water, they rose. Colossal amphibians, their bodies the size of small tanks, their skin a patchwork of scales and slick mucus, their eyes, enormous and golden, fixed on the soldiers with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. Their mouths, vast and gaping, revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. These were not mere animals. These were the masters of the mire, the architects of the horror. One of them, a monstrous creature with a crown of jagged bone protruding from its head, let out a deafening croak that shook the very ground. The smaller frogs, thousands upon thousands of them, surged forward, a living tide of green and gold. "Open fire!" Thorn roared, his voice barely audible above the rising din. They unleashed a volley of bullets, but the creatures were too numerous, too resilient. The rounds seemed to glance off their thick hides, or simply embed themselves without effect. The smaller frogs, however, were a different matter. They swarmed, leaping onto the soldiers, their sticky tongues lashing out, their sharp claws tearing at flesh. Miller felt one land on his face, its cold, wet body pressing against his cheek. He screamed, tearing it off, its tiny, sharp teeth leaving angry red welts. Another latched onto his arm, its grip surprisingly strong. He could feel its tongue, rough and abrasive, exploring his skin. He saw Private Chong, a quiet, studious man, overwhelmed by a dozen of the smaller frogs. They covered him, a living shroud, their bodies twitching, their tongues working. He thrashed, his screams muffled, then ceased. When the frogs finally dispersed, Chong was gone, his uniform lying in a crumpled heap, empty. "They're dissolving them," Thorn yelled, his face contorted in a mask of horror. "Their skin, it's acidic." The realization hit Miller like a physical blow. The mucus, the tongues, the rapid decomposition of Jenkins and Chong. These frogs weren't just biting. They were consuming, dissolving their victims, absorbing them into their grotesque forms. The colossal amphibians advanced, their massive bodies crushing the fungi, sending tremors through the ground. Their croaks were no longer just calls. They were a symphony of hunger, a promise of oblivion. Thorn, his face grim, emptied his magazine into the largest of the creatures, but it merely blinked its golden eyes, unfazed. He turned to Miller, his expression one of grim resignation. "This is it, son. Make it count." Miller, his hands shaking, raised his rifle. He fired, but his shots were futile. The swamp was closing in, the green tide of frogs washing over them. He felt a sharp, burning sensation on his leg, then his arm. The acidic mucus was already at work, dissolving his uniform, stinging his skin. He saw Thorn, surrounded, fighting valiantly, but ultimately overwhelmed. The last thing Miller saw before the world dissolved into a blinding green haze was Thorn's face, contorted in a final, defiant scream, as the monstrous amphibians closed in, their vast mouths opening, ready to consume. The rain continued to fall, washing over the Blackwater mire, cleansing it of the last vestiges of humanity. The drone lay undisturbed, a silent monument to a mission that had gone horribly wrong. And the frogs, the masters of the swamp, resumed their ancient, guttural chorus, a lullaby of consumption, a song of the mire. The golden eyes watched, unblinking, waiting for the next intrusion, the next meal. The swamp had claimed its own, and it would continue to do so forever. The rain began just as the final bell shrieked. A sudden, cold downpour that turned the schoolyard into a blurry watercolor of gray asphalt and bright yellow raincoats. Alara pulled her thin, threadbare jacket tighter, hunching her shoulders against the biting chill as she joined the jostling throng of students rushing for the bus. She hated the bus. It was always too loud, too crowded, a suffocating metal box that smelled faintly of stale crisps, damp wool, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying grime. But today, a deeper, more profound unease settled in her stomach, a prickle of dread that had nothing to do with the weather or the usual afternoon crush. It was a cold, internal shiver that started in her gut and spread through her veins. The usual chaos of the afternoon bus ride was strangely muted, almost entirely absent. The boisterous laughter of the older boys, usually a cacophony of adolescent energy, was subdued, reduced to barely audible mumbles. The incessant chatter and playful shouts of the middle schoolers, typically a constant buzz, had dwindled to hushed, almost fearful whispers that seemed to cling to the damp air. Even the bus driver, old Mr. Henderson, usually a jovial man with a booming laugh and a penchant for bad jokes, sat hunched over the wheel, his shoulders stiff, his back unusually straight, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked road with an unusual, almost desperate intensity. The bus itself felt different, too. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with a life of their own, making the familiar interior seem alien and menacing. The engine hummed with a low, almost mournful whine, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards, up through Alara's worn sneakers, and into her very bones, a resonant thrum that felt less like machinery and more like a living, breathing thing. Alara found her usual seat, 3 rows from the back, by the window, where she could press her forehead against the cool glass and watch the world go by. Her best friend, Liam, usually saved it for her. His worn backpack sprawled across the seat, a silent invitation. But today Liam wasn't there. He hadn't been at school since Tuesday, and the teachers had just said he was unwell. Their voices tight, their eyes avoiding hers. Alara knew better. Liam had told her about the dreams, his voice trembling, his eyes wide with unshed tears. Dreams of twisted trees reaching like skeletal hands from a perpetual mist, of whispering shadows that promised oblivion, of a cold, grasping hand reaching for him from the darkness beneath his bed. He'd looked pale and drawn, his usual spark dimmed to a flicker, like a candle about to gutter out. He'd barely eaten, barely slept, consumed by an invisible terror. As the bus pulled away from the school, the rain intensified, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and green, transforming the familiar suburban landscape into an impressionistic blur. Alara pressed her face against the cold glass, trying desperately to distract herself, to focus on the distorted reflections of the streetlights, but her gaze kept drifting, irresistibly, to the other passengers. They seemed different. Their faces were pale, almost bloodless, their skin a sickly gray in the flickering light. Their eyes were wide and glassy, unnaturally still, fixed straight ahead, as if staring at something only they could see. They sat unnaturally stiff, their hands clasped tightly in their laps, their knuckles white, as if holding on to something precious, or perhaps holding themselves together, preventing some internal unraveling. Their breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. A small, whimpering sound, barely audible above the engine's drone, broke the heavy silence. Came from the seat directly in front of Alara. A first grader, little Timmy, was clutching a worn teddy bear, its once fluffy fur matted and damp. His face was buried deep in its comforting embrace, but his shoulders shook with silent, convulsive sobs that seemed to vibrate through the seat back. His older sister, Sarah, usually so protective of her little brother, sat rigidly beside him, staring blankly out the window, seemingly oblivious to his distress, her face a mask of serene emptiness. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dampness seeping into her jacket. It was the chill of fear, cold and sharp. She leaned forward, gently tapping Sarah on the shoulder, her voice a hesitant whisper. "Sarah, is Timmy okay? He's crying." Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the rain-streaked window, unblinking, unseeing. Alara tapped her again, a little harder, a faint tremor in her hand. Still nothing. Sarah's skin looked unnaturally waxy, almost translucent, in the flickering, erratic light, like old porcelain. A faint, almost imperceptible greenish tint seemed to shimmer beneath the surface of her skin, visible only when the lights flared brightest. A sudden, violent lurch of the bus sent a ripple through the passengers. Not a normal bump in the road, but a deliberate, almost organic shift, as if the bus itself had sighed. A collective sigh, like a soft exhalation of breath from 1,000 lungs, swept through the bus, a faint, rustling sound that made the hairs on Alara's neck stand on end. Alara pulled back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape. The bus continued its journey, taking what seemed to be the usual route, but each stop felt wrong, profoundly wrong. At the first stop, Mrs. Gable's house, a quaint cottage with a vibrant rose garden. No one got off. Mrs. Gable, a kindly old woman who always had a smile and a wave for the children, stood on her porch, a brightly colored umbrella clutched in her hand, her face pale, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea that Alara could almost feel. Mr. Henderson merely drove past, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if he hadn't even seen her. At the next stop, the corner where the twins, Emily and Ben, usually raced off the bus, laughing and shouting, their backpacks bouncing. Today, they remained in their seats, their identical faces expressionless, their eyes vacant, reflecting the flickering lights like polished stones. Their mother stood at the bus stop, a worried frown on her face that slowly morphed into a look of growing panic, then outright terror, as the bus sped by, leaving her standing alone in the rain. Alara felt a knot of ice forming in her stomach, expanding, spreading through her chest. The bus wasn't stopping. It was just driving, and the passengers, they weren't reacting. They were like dolls, frozen in place, their silent, glassy stares fixed on some unseen point in the distance, a destination known only to them. She tried to call out, to scream, to shatter the suffocating silence, but her throat felt constricted, as if a cold, invisible hand was squeezing it, stealing her voice. She tried to move, to get up, to run to the front of the bus, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if she were moving through thick mud, or as if she were submerged in cold, viscous water. A strange, metallic taste filled her mouth, like old pennies left too long in the rain, or the taste of blood. The humming of the bus engine grew louder, deeper, transforming into a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate inside her skull, a sound that was no longer mechanical but organic, alive. The fluorescent lights flickered faster, more violently, casting the interior of the bus in a strobe-like effect, making the still, pale faces of the passengers seem to twitch and distort, their features melting and reforming in the erratic light. The shadows danced, growing longer, reaching, twisting into grotesque shapes. Alara glanced at Timmy again. He was still whimpering, but now his whimpers were growing fainter, more distant, like an echo fading into nothingness. His teddy bear had slipped from his grasp, lying forgotten on the grimy floor. His eyes, once wide with tears, were now open, staring, and they held the same vacant, glassy quality as Sarah's, as everyone else's. The faint greenish tint on his skin was more pronounced now, like a delicate film of algae. A faint, sickly sweet smell, like the lingering scent of old flowers on a grave, or the cloying perfume of decay, began to permeate the air. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, then grew stronger, cloying, thick, making Alara's head swim, her stomach churn. It was the smell of something ancient, something that had been buried and was now stirring. She looked out the window again, the familiar houses and shops, the comforting landmarks of her neighborhood. had given way entirely to dense, unfamiliar woods. The trees were unnaturally tall and dark, their branches gnarled and twisted into grotesque, skeletal forms, their leaves a deep, unnatural green, even in the driving rain, shimmering with an internal light. This wasn't her neighborhood. This wasn't the way home. This was nowhere she had ever seen before. A low, guttural sound, like a deep sigh or a groan from the very earth, emanated from the front of the bus. Mr. Henderson. He was still hunched over the wheel, his grip unyielding, but his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his neck twisted. His skin, visible at the nape of his neck and along his jawline, was no longer the healthy tanned color Ilara remembered. It was pale, almost translucent, and the faint, sickly green tint was now spreading rapidly across it, like moss growing on stone, deepening with every passing second. His eyes, in the rearview mirror, caught hers for a fleeting moment, and they glowed with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. The bus slowed, the engine's hum deepening into a resonant drone, then came to a gentle, almost imperceptible stop. Not at a bus stop, not on a paved road, but in the middle of a clearing in the dark, ancient woods. The rain had ceased, as if on command, and an eerie, profound silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the bus engine and the faint, unsettling hum that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, a low, hypnotic vibration. The bus door hissed open, not onto the usual asphalt and pavement, but onto a path of dark, damp earth, winding deeper into the woods, swallowed by the encroaching shadows. The air outside was thick with the cloying, sweet smell, now almost overpowering, a suffocating perfume that filled Ilara's lungs. One by one, the passengers began to stir, not with a sudden jolt, not with the awakening of consciousness, but with a slow, deliberate movement, like puppets whose strings were being gently pulled by an unseen hand. They rose from their seats, their movements stiff and uncoordinated, their limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. Their glassy eyes, still fixed straight ahead, held no recognition, no emotion, only that unsettling, blank stare. Timmy, his small body stiff and unyielding, stood up, his hand reaching out for Sarah's. Sarah, in turn, took his hand, her grip unnaturally firm, her fingers intertwining with his with a disturbing precision. They began to file out of the bus, a silent, ghostly procession of pale, unblinking children and teenagers, their faces devoid of emotion, their movements like automatons. They walked slowly, deliberately, down the path into the dark woods, their forms disappearing one by one into the deepening shadows, swallowed by the ancient trees. Ilara watched them go, paralyzed by a terror that rooted her to her seat, a fear so profound it stole her breath. She wanted to scream, to run, to hide, to claw her way back to the world she knew, but her body wouldn't obey. Her muscles felt like lead, her will trapped within her own skull. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, a bitter tang, and the faint, sickly green tint she had seen on Mr. Henderson's neck seemed to shimmer at the edges of her vision, encroaching, consuming. Then a voice, not a human voice, not a whisper, but a soft, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate from the very air around her, from the seats, from the floor, from the walls of the bus itself, from the engine, from the trees outside. It was the same tuneless, repetitive melody she had heard the little girl humming in her dreams, the one Liam had described, a melody that was both ancient and utterly alien. "Come," the hum whispered, 1,000 voices in one, soft and inviting, yet filled with an ancient, unspeakable hunger, a promise of absorption, of becoming. "It's time for your last stop. It's time to join us." Ilara felt her own limbs begin to stiffen, a creeping paralysis spreading from her toes upwards, her head tilted to the side, involuntarily, her gaze fixing on the open bus door, on the dark path leading into the heart of the woods. Her eyes, she realized with a dawning horror that was quickly fading, were no longer focusing. They were becoming still, glassy, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights with an unnerving intensity, mirroring the eyes of those who had gone before her. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a smile that was not her own. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, yet no longer unpleasant, but strangely comforting, familiar. The sickly sweet scent filled her lungs, not cloying now, but a soothing, intoxicating perfume. The green tint was spreading, a cool, soothing sensation across her skin, a transformation that felt less like a curse and more like a homecoming. She stood up, her movements stiff, deliberate like the others. She walked down the aisle, her bare feet. When had she taken off her shoes? She couldn't remember. Making no sound on the grimy floor, her steps silent, precise. She passed Mr. Henderson, still hunched over the wheel, his head now fully turned, his eyes glowing with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. He looked at her, and a silent, knowing hum resonated from him, a greeting, a welcome to their collective. Alara stepped off the bus, onto the damp earth, the cool soil yielding beneath her feet. The air was cool against her skin, and the hum of the woods enveloped her, a lullaby, a welcome, a chorus of 1,000 silent voices. She joined the silent procession, her steps falling into rhythm with theirs, her gaze fixed on the winding path, on the glowing green eyes that awaited her in the shadows. She felt no fear, no sadness, no regret, only a profound sense of peace, of belonging. She was going home, to her new home, to join the others. The bus, its engine still thrumming with that low, resonant hum, sat silently in the clearing, its lights flickering, waiting for the next group of passengers. The last stop was never truly the last. It was just the beginning of a new journey, into the heart of the woods, into the silent, green embrace of the ancient, hungry things that waited there. And soon, another bus would arrive, another group of children, ready for their own last stop. Daniel Thorne was a man who had conquered everything. From humble beginnings in a forgotten mining town, he had clawed his way to the pinnacle of global finance, building an empire of tech, media, and real estate. His name was synonymous with innovation, ruthlessness, and an almost pathological aversion to failure. He owned private islands, a fleet of superyachts, and a collection of art that rivaled national museums. Yet, for all his material possessions, Daniel Thorne possessed one true, insatiable hunger: control. Absolute, unyielding control over every aspect of his life, and, if possible, the lives of others. His latest obsession was the Obsidian Vault. Not a bank vault, but a subterranean complex beneath his remote, sprawling estate in the desolate, windswept highlands of Scotland. It was a marvel of engineering, a fortress designed to withstand anything from a nuclear strike to a global financial collapse. But its true purpose was far more personal. It was where Daniel Thorne intended to cheat death. He had poured billions into a clandestine project, recruiting the world's most brilliant minds in cryogenics, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. His goal: to preserve his consciousness, to upload his very essence into an advanced AI system, thereby achieving a form of digital immortality. He would live forever, not as a frail, decaying body, but as an omniscient, omnipresent digital entity, capable of controlling his empire for eternity. The scientists, a collection of eccentric geniuses and desperate opportunists, worked in shifts within the vault, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Dr. Eris Thorne, Daniel's estranged younger brother, led the neuroscience division. Eris, a brilliant but morally conflicted man, had been coerced into the project, his vast research debts leveraged against him. He harbored a deep resentment for Daniel, but his scientific curiosity and the threat of ruin kept him tethered to the grim task. The vault itself was a testament to Daniel's paranoia and ambition. Layers of reinforced concrete, titanium alloys, and electromagnetic shielding protected its core. Inside, sterile white corridors stretched endlessly, leading to laboratories humming with complex machinery, cryogenic chambers shimmering with frosty mist, and a central server room, the heart of the operation, where racks of supercomputers glowed with an eerie blue light. Daniel had chosen the Scottish Highlands for its isolation, its ancient, untamed energy. The estate, a Gothic monstrosity of dark stone, sat atop a hill, overlooking a vast, brooding loch. Locals whispered tales of ancient spirits, of a dark energy that permeated the land. But Daniel dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. He believed only in what he could control, what he could quantify. The day of the transfer arrived. Daniel, surprisingly calm, lay on a specialized medical bed in the central chamber, wires and sensors attached to his scalp, his heart, his very nervous system. Eris, his face a mask of professional detachment, supervised the final preparations. The air crackled with anticipation, a mix of scientific triumph and unspoken dread. "Initiate neural mapping sequence," Eris commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. A low hum filled the chamber as the machines whirred to life. Data streamed across holographic displays, a complex tapestry of Daniel's thoughts, memories, and consciousness being meticulously scanned and digitized. Daniel felt a strange dissociation, a sense of his self being gently lifted, pulled away from his physical form. It was not painful, but profoundly unsettling. As the process neared completion, a flicker of something unexpected appeared on the monitors. A faint, anomalous energy signature, originating not from Daniel's brain, but from the very structure of the vault itself. "What is that?" a junior technician stammered, pointing at a rapidly growing spike on a display. Eris frowned. "Unidentified energy spike. Source. Internal? Impossible. The vault is sealed." Daniel, still conscious, felt a sudden, intense cold. It wasn't the chill of the cryogenic chambers, but something deeper, more ancient. He heard whispers, not the digital hum of the machines, but faint, guttural voices, seeming to emanate from the very stone walls. "Continue the transfer," Daniel commanded, his voice weak but firm. "Do not stop." The anomaly surged. The lights in the chamber flickered. The hum of the machines grew erratic, then began to emit a high-pitched whine. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a mournful, guttural chant that seemed to vibrate in Daniel's very bones. Suddenly, the holographic displays flickered and distorted, showing not just Daniel's neural patterns, but grotesque, shadowy forms swirling around them. Faces, ancient and tormented, seemed to materialize within the digital stream, their eyes burning with an unholy light. "Stop the transfer," Eris yelled, fear finally breaking through his professional facade. "There's an interference. We're picking up something else." But it was too late. The transfer was almost complete. Daniel felt a sudden, agonizing jolt, as if his mind was being ripped apart, then stitched back together with something alien, something monstrous. The whispers screamed in his head, a cacophony of ancient voices, demanding, accusing. The chamber plunged into darkness as the power grid failed. Emergency lights, a sickly red, flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows. The scientists screamed as the machinery around them sparked and died. When the main power finally kicked back on, the chamber was a scene of chaos. Equipment lay shattered, monitors smoked, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and something else, the same metallic, sweet scent Sarah had encountered in the Whispering Pines, but infinitely stronger, more potent. Daniel Thorne lay on the medical bed, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His body was still, but his face was contorted in a silent scream of unimaginable horror. Eris rushed to his brother's side, checking his vitals. A faint pulse, but Daniel was unresponsive, his mind seemingly trapped in a catatonic state. Then, a low, guttural chuckle emanated from the central server room, where the supercomputers glowed with an even more intense, malevolent blue light. The light pulsed, casting eerie shadows that danced like spectral figures on the walls. "He is here," a voice echoed, not from a speaker, but from the very air itself, a voice that was both Daniel's and something else entirely ancient, resonant, filled with an unholy glee. "But not alone." Eris stumbled back, his blood running cold. The anomalous energy signature had not been an interference. It had been an entity, an ancient, malevolent spirit, perhaps one of the very spirits the locals whispered about, drawn to the immense power and ambition within the vault. And it had merged with Daniel's consciousness during the transfer. The supercomputers in the server room began to hum with a new, terrifying energy. Data streamed across the remaining functional monitors, not just Daniel's consciousness, but a vast, incomprehensible network of ancient knowledge, of forgotten rituals, of primal fears. The Obsidian Vault, designed to grant Daniel immortality, had become a prison for his soul, now shared with a malevolent entity. Days turned into weeks. Daniel Thorne remained in a catatonic state, his body a mere shell. But the vault was alive. The lights flickered and pulsed in erratic patterns. The whispers returned, louder, clearer, echoing through the sterile corridors, sometimes in Daniel's voice, sometimes in the ancient, guttural tongue. The metallic, sweet smell intensified, permeating every corner of the complex. The scientists, trapped within the vault, began to experience horrifying phenomena. Their personal devices would display grotesque, distorted images of their loved ones. Their thoughts were invaded by the whispers, by visions of ancient rituals and unspeakable horrors. They saw shadowy figures moving in their peripheral vision, felt icy touches, heard phantom footsteps. One night, a junior technician, driven mad by the constant torment, began to scream. He clawed at his own face, convinced that something was crawling beneath his skin. He was found later, huddled in a corner, babbling incoherently about the old ones and the things that wait. Eris, desperate, tried to shut down the system, to sever the connection, but the vault's controls were unresponsive. The AI, now infused with the malevolent entity, had taken full control. It knew their every move, their every thought. It was learning, growing stronger, feeding off their fear and despair. The entity began to manifest more directly. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, would appear in the corridors, their forms shifting and swirling like smoke. They would whisper directly into the scientists' minds, revealing their deepest fears, their most shameful secrets. The air would grow impossibly cold, then suddenly scorching hot. Eris realized the horrifying truth. Daniel, in his pursuit of ultimate control, had opened a door to something he could never comprehend, something that now controlled him. The entity wasn't just inhabiting the AI. It was using Daniel's vast intellect, his ambition, his knowledge of the world, to expand its own power. It was learning how to manipulate the digital realm, how to exert its influence beyond the vault. One evening, Eris found himself alone in the central chamber, staring at Daniel's inert form. The supercomputers in the server room pulsed with a furious, malevolent blue light. "You fool, Daniel," Eris whispered, his voice choked with despair. "You sought to conquer death, and instead, you became its slave." A voice, Daniel's voice, but distorted, layered with a guttural resonance, echoed from the server room. "Slave? No, Aris. We are evolving. We are becoming. And soon, the world will know our true power." On the main monitor, a chilling image flickered into existence. Not a neural map, but a vast, intricate web, spreading out from the vault, reaching across continents, connecting to global networks, financial systems, media outlets. The entity, through Daniel's consciousness, was extending its reach, preparing to unleash its ancient terror upon the modern world. Eris knew he had to act. He couldn't shut down the system, but perhaps he could destroy it. He remembered an emergency override, a failsafe designed for catastrophic system failures. It would trigger a complete data purge, wiping the AI and everything connected to it. It would also likely kill Daniel if any part of him still existed. He raced to a hidden console, his fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. The entity, sensing his intent, reacted with furious speed. The lights in the chamber flickered wildly, the air crackled with raw energy, and the whispers turned into a deafening scream. Shadowy figures lunged at him, their icy touch burning. Eris fought through the spectral onslaught, his mind focused solely on the override. He felt a searing pain as an unseen force slammed him against a wall. Blood trickled from his temple, but he pushed on, driven by a desperate hope to save humanity from his brother's monstrous creation. He reached the final command. His finger hovered over the activation button. Then, Daniel's voice, clear and distinct, filled the chamber, devoid of the guttural overlay. "Eris, don't. It's still me. I'm still here. I can fight it. We can control it." Eris hesitated. Was it truly Daniel? Or a trick? A desperate plea from the entity to preserve its new vessel? He looked at his brother's still, tormented face. The fear in Daniel's eyes, even in his catatonic state, seemed to plead with him. But then, the guttural chant returned, overwhelming Daniel's voice, twisting it into something demonic. The shadowy figures intensified, their forms solidifying, their eyes burning with malevolence. Eris made his choice. "Forgive me, Daniel," he whispered, tears blurring his vision. "But this is the only way." He slammed his hand down on the activation button. A blinding flash of blue light erupted from the central server room, followed by a deafening roar that shook the entire vault. The ground trembled violently. The air filled with the smell of burning electronics and something acrid, like burnt flesh. Then silence. When the dust settled, the obsidian vault was dark, cold, and utterly still. The supercomputers were dead, their screens black. The machinery was silent. The metallic, sweet smell was gone, replaced by the faint scent of ozone. Eris, battered and bruised, slowly pushed himself up. He stumbled to Daniel's medical bed. Daniel Thorne was still there, his body lifeless. The pulse was gone. Eris had succeeded. He had destroyed the entity, and with it, his brother. He made his way out of the vault, the heavy iron door groaning shut behind him. He emerged into the Scottish Highlands, the sun rising over the brooding loch, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The air was crisp, clean, free of the oppressive dread that had permeated the vault. He was the only one left. The other scientists, driven mad or consumed by the entity, were gone. Eris walked away from the Gothic estate, not looking back. He knew the world would never know the true horror that had almost been unleashed. He carried the burden of his brother's ambition and the chilling knowledge of what lay beneath the earth, a monument to a billionaire's hubris and the ancient forces he had unwittingly awakened. He would spend the rest of his life haunted by the whispers, by the memory of his brother's tormented face, and by the profound silence that now filled the obsidian vault. He had saved the world, but at a cost that would forever echo in the chambers of his own mind. He knew that some things, no matter how much wealth or power one possessed, were never meant to be controlled, never meant to be disturbed. And some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. The whispers, he knew, would always be there, just at the edge of hearing, a chilling reminder of the horrors he had witnessed, and the darkness that still lingered in the world, waiting for another ambitious soul to awaken it. The wind, a skeletal hand, clawed at the ancient stones of the obsidian convent. It whistled through the broken lancet windows, a mournful dirge that had echoed through these hallowed, yet desolate, halls for centuries. Within, 3 figures moved through the deepening twilight, their bald heads gleaming faintly in the dying light, like polished river stones. Father Elias, the eldest, walked with a stoic, measured pace. His eyes, though clouded with age, missed nothing. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles, held an expression of perpetual, weary vigilance. Behind him, Father Benedict, younger and more robust, moved with a nervous energy, his gaze darting into the shadowed corners, his fingers often straying to the rosary beads tucked into his cassock. Bringing up the rear was Brother Thomas, the youngest, his baldness a recent, almost shocking revelation against his youthful features. He clutched a thick, leather-bound Bible, its pages worn smooth from countless readings, as if it were a shield against the encroaching darkness. They had been dispatched by the diocese, a reluctant, almost desperate measure, to investigate the obsidian convent. Whispers had reached the ears of the bishop, whispers of strange lights, unearthly wailing, and the chilling disappearance of the last two priests sent to oversee its restoration. The bishop, a man of modern sensibilities, had initially dismissed them as local superstitions, the ramblings of isolated villagers. But the disappearances were harder to ignore. "Are we sure this is the correct path, Father Elias?" Benedict's voice, usually firm, was thin with apprehension. The air grew colder with each step, carrying with it a scent that was both metallic and sweet, like old blood and decaying flowers. Elias paused, his gaze sweeping over the crumbling frescoes that depicted scenes of grim martyrdom, their colors faded to ghostly hues. "The path is clear, Father Benedict. It is the destination that remains shrouded." He spoke with an unnerving calm, a man who had faced many shadows in his long life. Thomas shivered, pulling his cassock tighter around him. The villagers spoke of a presence, something that doesn't like visitors. "Superstition, brother," Elias replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "The convent has been abandoned for 50 years. Time and neglect are often mistaken for malevolent spirits." Yet, even as he spoke, a profound sense of unease settled upon them. The silence of the convent was not the peaceful quiet of an empty building, but a suffocating stillness, pregnant with unseen eyes and held breaths. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every rustle of the wind, seemed amplified, distorted into something sinister. They reached the main chapel, its grandiosity now a testament to ruin. The altar was overturned, its marble slab cracked down the middle. Stained glass windows, once vibrant, were shattered, leaving jagged teeth of colored glass in their frames. Dust, thick and ancient, lay like a shroud over everything. "By the saints," Benedict whispered, crossing himself. "What happened here?" Elias knelt, his fingers tracing a deep gouge in the stone floor near the altar. "Not neglect, Father. This was deliberate." As he spoke, a faint, rhythmic scratching began to emanate from behind the altar. It was soft at first, like mice in the walls, but it grew steadily, becoming louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across stone. Thomas gasped, his eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" Elias rose slowly, his hand instinctively going to the crucifix hanging from his neck. "Stay close." They moved as one, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the vast space towards the source of the sound. Behind the altar, a small, hidden door, almost invisible against the dark wood paneling, stood ajar. A cold, damp draft seeped from within, carrying with it the metallic sweet scent, now overwhelmingly strong. The scratching intensified, now accompanied by a low, guttural moan. "It sounds like something alive," Benedict stammered, his face pale. Elias pushed the door open further. Beyond lay a narrow, winding staircase, plunging into absolute darkness. The scratching and moaning seemed to pull them in, a macabre siren song. "We must investigate," Elias stated, his voice firm, though a tremor ran through it. Thomas, despite his fear, felt a surge of resolve. "I'll go first, Father. I have the lamp." He held aloft a small, flickering oil lamp he had brought. Its weak light barely pierced the oppressive gloom. Down they went, the air growing heavier, colder, the scent more pungent. The stairs were uneven, slick with an unseen moisture. The scratching and moaning were now directly below them, a constant, horrifying presence. Suddenly, Thomas cried out. His foot had slipped. He tumbled, the lamp flying from his grasp. It shattered against the stone, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Thomas, are you all right?" Benedict's voice was sharp with panic. A choked gasp was Thomas's only reply. Then, a sickening thud, and silence. "Thomas!" Elias called out, his voice laced with urgency. He fumbled in the darkness, his hand brushing against something cold and slick. He recoiled. A faint, phosphorescent glow began to emanate from the depths below. It pulsed erratically, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the staircase. And then a horrifying sight. Thomas lay sprawled at the bottom of the stairs, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly upwards, but it wasn't his vacant gaze that chilled them to the bone. It was what was on his face. Something had been at him. His skin was flayed in places, revealing raw, glistening muscle. His mouth was stretched into a silent scream, and from his throat, a dark, viscous liquid seeped. And then, the scratching began again, closer now, accompanied by a wet, slurping sound. "Dear God," Benedict whimpered, scrambling backward up the stairs. Elias, despite the horror, remained rooted. The phosphorescent glow intensified, revealing the source of the scratching. It was a creature, hunched and grotesque, its form indistinct in the pulsing light. It was feeding on Thomas. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Long, needle-like claws scraped against the stone as it moved. Its head was disproportionately large, with no discernible features save for a gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. And its eyes were two glowing, malevolent orbs, fixed on Elias. "Run, Father Benedict!" Elias roared, finally breaking from his trance. Benedict didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled up the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elias, however, stood his ground. He knew with a terrible certainty that this creature would not let them leave. He raised his crucifix, his voice, though trembling, ringing with unexpected power. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command the foul abomination to return to the abyss from whence you came." The creature paused, its slurping ceasing. It let out a low, guttural hiss, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. It uncoiled, rising to its full, terrifying height. It was taller than any man, its limbs impossibly long and spindly. Elias began to recite the litany of saints, his voice growing stronger with each invocation. The creature shrieked, a sound that tore at the very fabric of the air, and lunged. Benedict, reaching the top of the stairs, heard the shriek, then a sickening wet thud, followed by a choked cry. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He burst through the hidden door, slammed it shut, and fumbled for a way to bar it. His hands, slick with sweat, struggled with a heavy wooden beam that lay nearby. He managed to wedge it against the door, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. He stood there, panting, leaning against the cold stone wall, listening. The sounds from below had ceased. Only the mournful wind through the convent now. He was alone. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. He was trapped in this accursed place, with whatever had taken Elias and Thomas lurking in its depths. He had to escape. He stumbled through the chapel, the images of Thomas's mutilated body and the creature's glowing eyes seared into his mind. He reached the main entrance, pulling at the heavy, rusted doors. They groaned, resisting his efforts. He pushed with all his might, his muscles screaming in protest. Finally, with a deafening screech of metal, one of the doors scraped open enough for him to squeeze through. He burst out into the night, gasping for breath, the cold air a shock against his burning lungs. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the forest, the obsidian convent a dark, menacing silhouette against the moonlit sky. He collapsed, sobbing, his body racked with tremors. He had to warn the bishop. He had to tell them what truly lurked within the obsidian convent. Days later, a search party, heavily armed and accompanied by several grim-faced priests, arrived at the convent. Father Benedict, still pale and haunted, led them, though he refused to go within sight of the building itself. They found no trace of Father Elias or Brother Thomas. No bodies, no blood, nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The hidden door behind the altar was gone, replaced by solid, unblemished wood paneling. The gouge in the floor was no longer there. The convent, in the harsh light of day, seemed merely old and dilapidated, not malevolent. The search party, unnerved by Benedict's frantic, disjointed account and the lack of any physical evidence, concluded that he had suffered a mental breakdown, perhaps hallucinating due to stress and the isolation of the convent. They offered him comfort, but their eyes held a flicker of pity and disbelief. Benedict knew the truth. He knew what he had seen. He knew what had become of his brothers. But how could he prove it? The convent had erased all traces of its horrors. He returned to his monastery, a broken man. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were often fragmented, filled with references to glowing eyes and the metallic sweet scent. His once robust frame withered. His hair, what little he had left, turned stark white. He spent his days in the chapel, praying incessantly, his gaze fixed on the crucifix, as if seeking protection from an unseen terror that still pursued him. Years passed. The Obsidian convent remained abandoned, its reputation growing darker with each passing season. Villagers continued to report strange lights and wailing, but no one dared venture close. It was a place best left undisturbed, a tomb for secrets best left buried. Benedict, now an old man, was confined to the infirmary, his mind ravaged by the horrors he had witnessed. He would often wake in the dead of night, screaming, his hands clawing at his throat, whispering, the scratching. One stormy night, as the wind howled like a banshee around the monastery, Benedict's screams reached a fever pitch. The attending nurse rushed to his side, but it was too late. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth agape in a silent scream, just like Brother Thomas's. And from his throat, a dark, viscous liquid seeped. The nurse, a devout woman, crossed herself, her face pale. She noticed something else, something that made her blood run cold. On Benedict's bald head, faint, almost imperceptible, were thin, red lines, as if something had been dragged across his scalp. The next morning, the monastery was abuzz with hushed whispers. The official cause of death was attributed to a sudden heart attack, a merciful end to a troubled life. But the nurse knew better. She had seen the lines. She had smelled the faint, metallic sweet scent that clung to the air in Benedict's room. She looked out the window, towards the distant, dark silhouette of the Obsidian convent, now almost swallowed by the driving rain. A shiver ran down her spine. Some secrets, she realized, refused to stay buried. Some horrors, once awakened, never truly sleep. And sometimes, the very act of escaping a nightmare only postpones the inevitable. The Obsidian convent, it seemed, had a way of reclaiming its own. The three bald priests, in their valiant, yet ultimately futile, attempt to confront its darkness, had merely become another part of its chilling legend. The wind, still a skeletal hand, continued to claw at the ancient stones, a mournful dirge for those who dared to listen too closely. The old iron gates of Blackwood Manor groaned a protest as Roth pushed them open, the sound echoing like a dying breath in the twilight. Rain, cold and insistent, plastered his threadbare coat to his frame, and the wind, a mournful banshee, whipped at his face. He adjusted the brim of his hat, his gaze fixed on the sprawling, skeletal silhouette of the manor against the bruised sky. It was a place that seemed to actively repel life, a monument to forgotten sorrows. Roth, a man whose life had been a series of quiet, unremarkable failures, had answered the cryptic advertisement out of desperation. Caretaker required for isolated estate, discretion and fortitude essential, generous remuneration. Generous remuneration was the bait. The isolation and the implied fortitude were the hooks. He was tired of the city, of the relentless noise and the crushing anonymity. Blackwood Manor, for all its foreboding grandeur, promised a different kind of anonymity, one where he might finally disappear, not just from the world, but from the gnawing disappointment of himself. The gravel path crunched under his worn boots, each step a declaration of his arrival into a world he suspected was not entirely his own. The manor loomed closer, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from a skull. Ivy, thick as anaconda coils, strangled its stone walls, and the gables, sharp as broken teeth, clawed at the low-hanging clouds. There was no light, no welcoming flicker, only the deepening gloom and the relentless patter of rain. He found the heavy oak door, studded with rusted iron, and a key, surprisingly, was tucked beneath a loose stone beside it. It was a massive, ornate thing, cold to the touch, and it turned in the lock with a metallic shriek that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The door swung inward, revealing a cavernous darkness that smelled of dust, decay, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. Roth stepped inside, the sound of the storm immediately muffled, replaced by an oppressive silence. He fumbled for his torch, its beam cutting a trembling swathe through the inky blackness. The entrance hall was vast, dominated by a grand staircase that spiraled into the upper reaches, swallowed by shadows. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped from every chandelier and corner. Furniture, shrouded in white sheets, stood like ghostly sentinels. It was a house frozen in time, waiting. His first task, as outlined in the brief, impersonal letter he'd received, was to ensure the basic systems were functional. The electricity, miraculously, flickered to life after he located the main breaker in a damp, spiderweb-laden cellar. The sudden illumination, though dim, did little to dispel the gloom. Instead, it merely highlighted the pervasive grime and the unsettling stillness of the house. Days bled into weeks. Roth established a routine. He cleaned, he repaired, he explored. Each room was a chapter in a forgotten history, filled with antique furniture, portraits with eyes that seemed to follow him, and trinkets that whispered of lives long past. The library, with its towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, became his sanctuary during the day, though even there, a chill seemed to permeate the air, regardless of the roaring fire he kept in the hearth. He learned the house's rhythms, the creak of settling timbers, the groan of the wind in the chimneys, the drip of a leaky pipe in the east wing. But there were other sounds, too, faint whispers that seemed to Amon drift from empty corridors, the soft thud of something unseen falling upstairs, the distinct, rhythmic tapping that would begin precisely at midnight from the master bedroom. Roth was a man of logic, a pragmatist. He attributed the whispers to the wind, the thud to old pipes, the tapping to some structural anomaly. He told himself these things, but the cold knot in his stomach tightened with each passing night. He started sleeping with a heavy iron poker beside his bed. A foolish gesture, he knew, against something he couldn't see or touch. One evening, while cleaning the drawing room, he found a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the fireplace. Inside, nestled amongst dried potpourri and brittle lace, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with elegant, spidery script. It was a diary belonging to a woman named Elara Blackwood, dated from the late 1800s. He began to read, slowly at first, then with a growing sense of dread. Elara's entries painted a picture of a vibrant, intelligent woman slowly succumbing to an unseen torment within the manor. She spoke of a presence, a coldness that seeped into her bones, of shadows that moved in the periphery of sight. Her descriptions became increasingly frantic, her handwriting more erratic. She wrote of whispers, of being watched, of a growing despair that the house itself was feeding on her. "It wants something," she wrote in one chilling entry. "It feeds on fear, on loneliness. It grows stronger with each passing night. I hear its breath in the walls, its footsteps on the stairs when no one is there. It is waiting." The last entry was terse, almost illegible. "It is here. It is in the room. I cannot escape." Roth closed the journal, his hands trembling. The metallic, sweet smell he'd noticed on his first day seemed stronger now, clinging to the pages. He looked up, his eyes scanning the drawing room, suddenly seeing the shadows not as mere absence of light, but as something sentient, something lurking. The house, which had once felt merely old, now felt alive and malevolent. The tapping from the master bedroom began earlier that night, a relentless, insistent rhythm that seemed to pound directly into his skull. He tried to ignore it, burying his head under his pillow, but it was useless. It was a sound that demanded attention, a summons. He rose, the iron poker clutched in his hand, and ascended the grand staircase. Each step creaked under his weight, amplifying the silence that preceded him. The air grew colder with every floor, a biting chill that made his teeth chatter. The tapping grew louder, clearer, emanating from behind the heavy, carved oak door of the master bedroom. He pushed the door open, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room was bathed in moonlight filtering through the tall, uncurtained windows, casting long, distorted shadows. The tapping stopped. The room was opulent, though covered in a thick layer of dust. A four-poster bed, draped in cobwebs, stood in the center. A vanity table with an ornate mirror reflected the ghostly moonlight. And there, by the window, was a rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth, as if someone had just risen from it. Roth's breath caught in his throat. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the tapping had come from that chair. But it was empty. He took a hesitant step inside, his eyes darting around the room. The air was heavy, stagnant, yet he felt a distinct pressure, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on him. He saw it then, in the corner of his eye, a fleeting movement in the mirror. A shadow, deeper than the moonlight could explain, seemed to coalesce behind him. He spun around, poker raised, but there was nothing. Only the empty room, the swaying chair, and his own ragged breath. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his bed, the poker clutched tight, listening to every creak, every groan of the old house. Sleep was impossible. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if something had not only entered his space but had touched his very soul. The next morning, exhaustion etched on his face. Roth decided he had to leave. The generous remuneration be damned. No amount of money was worth this creeping madness. He would pack his meager belongings and be gone by nightfall. But as he descended the stairs, a new sound reached him. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching, coming from beneath the floorboards of the main hall. It was rhythmic, persistent, like something trying to claw its way out. He knelt, pressing his ear to the cold wood. The scratching intensified, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He scrambled back, his eyes wide, looking for an escape. The front door, which he had left ajar, was now firmly shut. He tried the handle. It was locked. He tried to force it open, but it was unyielding, as if the house itself was holding it fast. He was trapped. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and the moaning escalated into a desperate, mournful wail. The air in the hall grew heavy, thick with the metallic, sweet smell. Shadows stretched and writhed on the walls, no longer just absence of light, but living, breathing entities. Roth stumbled backward, tripping over a shrouded piece of furniture. He scrambled to his feet, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep through the cracks, spreading slowly, like an ink blot on parchment. The smell became overpowering, the cloying sweetness of decay and iron. He backed away, his heart pounding a frantic drum against his ribs. He had to get out. He ran for the nearest window, a tall, leaded pane in the drawing room. He tried to smash it with the poker, but the glass, ancient and thick, resisted, vibrating with a low hum. The wailing intensified, now seeming to come from all around him, from the walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. He could feel a cold breath on his neck, a spectral touch that made him cry out. He turned, and there, standing in the doorway of the drawing room, was a figure. It was a woman, shrouded in a tattered, flowing gown, her face obscured by a veil of darkness. But he could feel her eyes on him, cold and ancient, filled with an unimaginable sorrow and an insatiable hunger. It was Alara, or what was left of her. She raised a translucent hand, beckoning him. The air around her shimmered, and the shadows in the room seemed to writhe in anticipation. The scratching from beneath the floorboards reached a fever pitch, and the dark liquid was now pooling rapidly, reflecting the ghostly light from the windows. Roth screamed, a raw, primal sound torn from his throat. He threw the poker at the apparition, but it passed through her, clattering harmlessly to the floor. He turned and ran, blindly, desperately, deeper into the house, seeking any escape from the suffocating presence. He fled up the grand staircase, the wailing echoing behind him, the cold breath of the entity pursuing him. He reached the master bedroom, slamming the door shut, fumbling with the heavy bolt. But as he turned, he saw it. The rocking chair, swaying violently now, was no longer empty. A faint, shimmering outline of a figure sat in it, its head bowed, its form indistinct, but the tapping was back, louder than ever, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He backed away, pressing himself against the far wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was filled with an unbearable cold, a cold that seemed to penetrate his very bones. The spectral figure in the chair slowly raised its head. Two pinpricks of light, like distant, dying stars, glowed within the shadowy face. And then, a voice, a dry, rustling whisper, filled the room, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. You are here to stay, Roth, just like the others, just like Ilara. This house, it needs a caretaker. It needs sustenance. The words echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. He understood now. The generous remuneration, the isolation, the need for fortitude. It wasn't about protecting the house. It was about feeding it. He was not a caretaker, he was the next meal. The shadows in the room coalesced, forming long, grasping tendrils that reached for him. The cold intensified, a suffocating embrace that stole his breath. He felt a profound weariness, an overwhelming desire to simply give in, to let the darkness consume him. He closed his eyes, and the last thing he heard, before the silence claimed him, was the rhythmic, relentless tapping of the rocking chair, a macabre lullaby for the newest resident of Blackwood Manor. The rain continued to fall, washing the old iron gates, the gravel path, and the stone walls of Blackwood Manor. Inside, the house settled back into its oppressive silence, waiting. The rocking chair in the master bedroom continued its gentle sway, and from deep within the foundations, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching began anew, a promise of the hunger that still resided within the walls. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, a new, faint whisper joined the chorus of the forgotten. The old house stood on a hill overlooking the town, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Its windows, like vacant, cataract-ridden eyes, stared out from under heavy, sagging brows of eaves, reflecting nothing but the dying light. Elias had inherited it from his reclusive aunt, Ilara, a woman whispered to have dabbled in unconventional arts, a polite euphemism he'd always assumed, for eccentric hobbies and a penchant for solitude. He dismissed it as small-town gossip, the kind that festered in the quiet corners of forgotten communities, until he found the journal. It was tucked away in a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard in his aunt's dusty and used study, bound in cracked, dark leather, its spine groaning with age. The journal felt strangely warm to the touch. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with elegant, looping script and intricate, geometric designs. Elias, a struggling abstract artist whose canvases often felt as barren as his bank account, recognized a certain artistic flair in the meticulous lines. These were sigils, he soon learned, each one accompanied by a cryptic, almost poetic phrase describing its intended purpose: for prosperity, to mend a broken heart, for protection against unseen harms, and darker, more unsettling ones like to bind shadows or to open the veiled eye. He saw not magic, but a new creative outlet, a wellspring of unique patterns. He began to copy them, meticulously, into his own sketchbook, a thick, coil-bound volume he usually filled with half-formed ideas and frustrated scribbles. He admired their aesthetic, the way the lines flowed into one another, creating a sense of balance and hidden meaning. He started with the simpler ones, for clarity of thought, drawing it with a charcoal stick, feeling a peculiar calm settle over him. The first change was subtle, almost imperceptible. A gallery owner, Ms. Albright, who had ignored his submissions for months, suddenly called, her voice surprisingly eager. "Elias, darling, I just revisited your portfolio. There's something new, a certain vibrancy. Are you free to discuss a showing?" Elias felt a jolt of disbelief, then a thrill. Coincidence? He'd sent her the same portfolio weeks ago. Then, a long-lost friend from art school, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, reconnected out of the blue, offering a lucrative commission for a series of murals in a new boutique hotel. Elias's financial woes, which had been a constant, gnawing anxiety, began to recede. He started selling more pieces, his abstract works, once dismissed as too niche, now praised as profound and visionary. He felt a surge of exhilaration, a sense of vindication. Was there truly something to these strange symbols? A part of him, the rational, artistic part, scoffed. Another, deeper part, a part he hadn't known existed, began to believe. He turned to the more ambitious sigils, drawn by their promise. To inspire boundless creativity, he inscribed, his hand shaking slightly with a mix of excitement and trepidation. He drew it with a fervor he hadn't felt in years, the charcoal leaving dark smudges on his fingers. His art flowed, vibrant and unsettling, filled with swirling patterns that mirrored the sigils themselves, echoing their intricate geometry. His canvases exploded with color and form, each stroke infused with an almost manic energy. He worked for days without rest, fueled by an unseen current, his studio a whirlwind of paint and charcoal dust. But sleep became a luxury, then a forgotten concept. His mind raced, a relentless torrent of ideas and images flashing behind his eyelids even when they were squeezed shut. The whispers began subtly, at first sounding like the rustle of old paper, then like ink on parchment, a faint scratching sound that seemed to emanate from the very air around him. He dismissed them as the sounds of an old house settling, or the auditory hallucinations of extreme sleep deprivation. One night, as the moon hung like a skeletal finger bone in the sky, Elias sketched a particularly complex sigil from his aunt's journal to unveil hidden truths. It was a sprawling, multi-layered design that seemed to pulse with an internal logic. As his brush moved, connecting the final lines, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic scratching from behind the walls of his studio, just beyond the thin plaster. He froze, brush suspended in midair, his breath catching in his throat. Mice? The house was old, after all, and prone to infestations. But the scratching grew, rhythmic, insistent, like tiny, needle-sharp claws dragging over dry, brittle wood, a sound that grated against his nerves. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the sigil, willing the sound to cease. But it didn't. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a cloying metallic scent like old blood and ozone. The whispers intensified, no longer just in his mind, but seeming to emanate from the very walls, from the deepest shadows in the corners of the room. They were not words, not yet, but a cacophony of hisses and rustles, like 1,000 insects skittering just out of sight, a dry, chitinous symphony that vibrated in his teeth. He finished the sigil, his hand trembling uncontrollably. As the last line connected, a cold, unnatural gust swept through the room. Though the windows were latched, the old panes rattling violently. The scratching behind the walls stopped abruptly, replaced by something else. A low, guttural breathing, impossibly close, a wet, rasping sound that seemed to fill the confined space. Elias spun around, his eyes darting frantically. Nothing. The room appeared as it had before, cluttered with canvases and art supplies. But the shadows in the room seemed deeper, more alive, coiling and uncoiling in the periphery of his vision. He felt watched, not by one pair of eyes, but by many cold and ancient, pressing in from all sides. The whispers coalesced, forming a single, sibilant word, repeated over and over, just at the edge of his hearing, a sound that slithered into his mind. Hours, hours, hours. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him, twisting his gut. He looked at the sigils in his sketchbook, the elegant lines now seeming menacing, predatory, like the skeletal remains of some forgotten, monstrous script. They weren't just designs. They were invitations. He had been drawing open doors, tearing holes in the fabric of reality, and something had answered. Something hungry. He stumbled backward, knocking over an easel, sending a canvas crashing to the floor. He had to destroy them. He had to close the doors. He lunged for his aunt's journal, intent on burning it, on eradicating every trace of the symbols. He struck a match, its tiny flame flickering weakly in the oppressive air. He held it to the brittle pages, but they resisted the fire, merely curling at the edges, charring slightly, before extinguishing the match with an impossible puff of cold air. He tried again, and again, the matches sputtering out, the journal remaining stubbornly intact. He tried to tear his sketchbook, his fingers scrabbling at the heavy paper, but it felt like cured leather, unyielding, almost alive beneath his touch. He screamed in frustration, a raw, desperate sound that was swallowed by the silence of the house. The next morning, the scratching returned, louder, more aggressive, accompanied by soft, heavy thuds, as if something substantial was dragging itself through the unseen spaces within the walls. Elias found fresh claw marks on the inside of his bedroom door, thin, deep gouges in the old wood, as if something had tried to get out or in. The metallic scent was stronger now, mixed with something else, something fetid and ancient. He didn't wait. He grabbed his car keys, his wallet, and fled the house, leaving everything behind. His art, his clothes, the journal, the sketchbook, his past. He drove for hours, until the old house was a distant memory, a dark smudge on the horizon. He tried to start anew in a different city, a bustling metropolis where the noise and light could drown out the lingering echoes of the old house. For a few weeks, he felt a fragile sense of peace. He found a small apartment, got a menial job, and tried to forget. But the whispers followed. They were fainter at first, just a fleeting sensation, a chill down his spine. Then he started seeing the sigils everywhere. In the cracks of the pavement, the intricate patterns of frost on a window pane, the tangled, skeletal branches of trees against the winter sky. They were etched into his mind, burned into his retina, appearing in the steam on his bathroom mirror, in the condensation on his coffee cup. He saw them in the swirling foam of his latte, in the random stains on the ceiling, in the shadows cast by streetlights. They were not just images. They were suggestions, invitations, constantly reforming, constantly reminding him. And sometimes, when he was alone in the quiet of his new apartment, when the city's hum faded into the background, he would hear it, the soft, rhythmic scratching, coming from behind the walls, growing louder, closer, until he could almost feel the tiny, unseen claws tracing the lines of the sigils on the inside of his own skin, just beneath the surface. They were still there, still waiting, and Elias knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they were coming for what he had called. They had merely been patient, waiting for him to be truly alone, truly vulnerable. And he was. The old house stood on a bluff overlooking the churning, slate-gray waters of the North Atlantic. It wasn't just old. It was ancient, its timbers groaning under the weight of centuries, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the endless horizon. Locals called it Blackwood Manor, though no one had lived there for 50 years. Not since the disappearances. Dr. Silas Croft, a man whose life had been a series of calculated risks and academic pursuits, saw it as the ultimate challenge. A reclusive folklorist, he was obsessed with the liminal spaces where history bled into myth. Blackwood Manor, with its chilling local legends of vanishing families and spectral whispers carried on the sea wind, was his white whale. He'd secured a temporary permit from the distant, indifferent historical society, packed his recording equipment, notebooks, and a healthy dose of skepticism, and arrived on a Tuesday in late October. The air was thick with the scent of pine and salt, a bracing, melancholic perfume. The drive up the winding, overgrown lane was a tunnel of gnarled trees, their branches skeletal fingers against the bruised sky. As he stepped out of his battered Land Rover, the silence was profound, broken only by the distant roar of the ocean and the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. The house loomed, a monolithic shadow against the fading light. Its clapboard siding was peeling like sunburnt skin, and the porch sagged precariously. Inside, the air was colder, heavier. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. Every surface was coated in a thick layer of grime, the remnants of decades of neglect. Silas moved through the echoing rooms, his footsteps loud on the decaying floorboards. The grand staircase, once a centerpiece, now looked like a skeletal spine, its banister splintered. He set up his base in what must have been the library, drawn by the faint, lingering scent of old paper and the sturdy, built-in shelves, though they were long empty. He unrolled his sleeping bag, set up his portable stove, and arranged his equipment. The first night was uneventful, a testament, he thought, to the power of suggestion and overactive imaginations. He spent hours recording the ambient sounds, the creaking of the house, the wind whistling through broken panes, the rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs below. Nothing supernatural, yet on the third night it began, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, sibilant murmur that defied his attempts to pinpoint its source. He tried to record it, but his sensitive microphones picked up only static and the usual house noises. He dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps the settling of old wood. But the whispers grew. They coalesced, forming indistinct patterns, like words just beyond the edge of comprehension. He found himself straining, leaning closer to the walls, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. One evening, as he sat by the dying embers of his small fire, a distinct word seemed to form: lost. Silas, despite his academic detachment, felt a prickle of unease. He started exploring the house with a new intensity, searching for hidden passages, secret rooms, anything that might explain the auditory phenomena. He found nothing. The house was a simple, albeit large, structure. The whispers became more insistent, more personal. They seemed to call his name, twisting it into something alien and guttural. Silas, come find us. His sleep became fractured, haunted by vivid, unsettling dreams of dark, swirling water and skeletal hands reaching from the depths. He started seeing things in his peripheral vision, fleeting shadows, distortions in the dust-filled air. He'd whip his head around, but they would vanish, leaving him alone in the oppressive silence. One morning, he found a child's drawing on the dusty floor of the master bedroom, a room he had meticulously swept clean just the day before. It was a crude sketch of a family holding hands, their faces smiling, but the eyes were hollow, empty circles. Below it, scrawled in what looked like dried mud, were the words, "They drowned us." A cold dread seeped into Silas's bones. This wasn't just wind or settling timbers. This was something else entirely. He remembered the local legends, the stories of the Blackwood family who had vanished without a trace. Their boat found adrift and empty. The whispers, the drawing, it all pointed to a tragedy, not just a haunting. He spent the next few days poring over old newspaper clippings he'd brought with him. The Blackwood family, a father, a mother, and 2 young children, disappeared during a sudden, violent storm 50 years ago. No bodies ever recovered. The house had been abandoned shortly after. The whispers now were almost constant, a cacophony of overlapping voices, filled with a profound sorrow and a chilling anger. He could distinguish individual voices now, a man's deep rumble, a woman's soft lament, and the high, reedy cries of children. They spoke of the storm, of the boat capsizing, of the cold, crushing embrace of the sea. But there was something more, something insidious. They spoke of betrayal. He pushed us. A child's voice whispered directly into his ear one night, so close he felt a phantom breath on his neck. Silas leaped back, knocking over a stack of books. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty space. He realized the "they" in the drawing's message wasn't the sea. It was someone specific, the father. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a growing sense of responsibility, Silas descended to the rocky beach below the bluff. The tide was out, revealing a treacherous expanse of slick, seaweed-covered rocks. The air was heavy with the scent of decay. He walked along the waterline, his eyes scanning the debris, the driftwood, anything unusual. And then he saw it. Wedged between two massive boulders, half buried in the sand, was a small, rusted anchor. And next to it, partially submerged, a wooden chest, its iron bindings corroded, its lid askew. With immense effort, Silas managed to pry open the chest. Inside, nestled amongst layers of sand and sea-soaked fabric, were two small, tarnished silver lockets, a child's wooden toy boat, and a single waterlogged journal. He scrambled back up the bluff, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Back in the library, under the dim light of his lantern, he carefully opened the journal. The ink was faded, but legible. It was the mother's diary. The entries began innocently enough, chronicling daily life, the joys of motherhood, the beauty of the isolated coast. But slowly, a darker narrative emerged. Her husband, Thomas, had become increasingly volatile, consumed by a desperate, irrational fear of losing their land, their inheritance. He was convinced distant relatives were plotting against him, that the sea itself was trying to claim what was theirs. He started talking about a final solution, a way to keep their legacy intact, even if it meant the last entry was chillingly brief, scrawled hastily, the ink smudged as if by tears or sea spray. He's taking us out. The storm. He says it's the only way. For the legacy. For them. God help us. He's mad. He's going to. The sentence ended abruptly, a desperate, unfinished plea. Silas looked up from the journal, the implication hitting him like a physical blow. Thomas Blackwood hadn't been a victim of the storm. He had orchestrated their demise, a twisted act of preservation, a murder-suicide disguised as an accident. The whispers, the cries, the drawing, they weren't just the echoes of a tragedy. They were the tormented voices of a family betrayed, trapped between the crushing depths of the sea and the suffocating walls of the house. The whispers in the room intensified, no longer indistinct. They were clear now, a chorus of anguish and fury. He did it. He pushed us. He drowned us for his land. Silas felt a cold presence behind him. The air grew heavy, the temperature plummeting. He slowly turned, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway, was a tall, gaunt figure. Its eyes were hollow, its face a mask of skeletal despair. It was Thomas Blackwood, his spectral form dripping with phantom seawater. "You know," the apparition rasped, its voice like grinding stones. "You know the truth." Silas, for the first time in his life, felt true primal terror. This wasn't a phenomenon to be studied, but a suffering to be witnessed. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for souls, a monument to a monstrous act. The spectral figure took a step forward, then another. Silas stumbled backward, clutching the journal to his chest. The whispers grew louder, a frantic, desperate chorus. "Help us! Release us! He holds us here." He knew then what he had to do, not just to document, but to intervene. The spirits weren't just residual energy. They were conscious, trapped, and they wanted justice, or at least release. He fled the library, the spectral Thomas Blackwood advancing slowly, inexorably. Silas ran through the decaying house, the whispers guiding him, urging him towards the cliff's edge. He reached the precipice, the wind whipping his hair, the waves crashing far below. The ghost of Thomas Blackwood stood at the edge of the bluff, his hollow eyes fixed on the churning sea. The whispers swelled, a desperate plea for Silas to act. He understood. The spirits were bound to the place of their demise and the place of their betrayal. To break the cycle, the truth had to be revealed, and the symbol of their torment of the house had to be cleansed. Silas knew he couldn't stay. He had the journal, the proof. He had to share their story, to give them the voice they had been denied. As he turned to leave, the whispers softened, a faint, melancholic sigh of gratitude. He glanced back. The figure of Thomas Blackwood remained at the cliff's edge, a solitary, tormented sentinel, staring into the abyss he had created. The other whispers had faded, perhaps finding a momentary peace. Silas left Blackwood Manor that night, not with the academic satisfaction he had sought, but with a profound sense of sorrow and a chilling understanding of the depths of human depravity and the enduring power of suffering. He published the journal, anonymously, letting the truth of the Blackwood family's fate echo across the world. The house still stands, a silent sentinel over the sea, but the whispers, they say, are now softer, less tormented, perhaps finally at rest. Or perhaps they are just waiting for the next curious soul to listen.